1 to 2 acres of Amazon rainforests are destroyed every second. Humanity has eradicated 60% of all wildlife since 1970. Species are disappearing at a rate 1,000 to 10,000 times the historical background extinction rate. 99% of coral reefs will die by 2100, and we could see fishless oceans as early as 2048 if we don't take drastic action starting immediately. The path to a carbon neutral future that avoids catastrophic climate change is a precipitous cliff that assumes humanity will successfully reduce carbon emissions by at least 5% year after year for the next 20 years. But even if, after decades of failing to take sufficient action to merely level off global carbon emissions, we were to achieve this ambitious goal, there would still be a 50% chance of climate catastrophe. As Greta Thunberg so passionately declared during her iconoclastic UN speech, a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. But what if we fail to do what must be done? What if, despite the best efforts of our leading climate scientists and the most impassioned pleas of our fellow activists, we fall short? Our Vegan Climate Summit is a vital effort to ensure we don't fall short. It brings together some of the leading thinkers at the intersection of environmental justice and animal rights, people with decades of experience fighting for a just, sustainable, animal-friendly future. It allows us to collectively pool our knowledge, then transform that knowledge into an actionable strategy for saving all life on Earth. It is my enormous privilege to preside over this year's Vegan Climate Summit in tandem with our global board member, Chance, and introduce you to the diverse ensemble of powerhouse speakers we have lined up for this special occasion, covering everything from the environmental catastrophe of animal agriculture to the ancient Grecian roots of modern-day veganism, to deceptive labeling tactics in the animal abuse industry, to the extraordinary climate impacts we have witnessed this year alone, to veganic agriculture and vegan policymaking. This one-of-a-kind event delivers incredible value you will struggle to find elsewhere. After all, our Vegan Climate Summit happens but once a year, and with over 350 people marked going and another 1.9K people marked interested, it is the largest climate summit of its kind in the world. If you are looking for hope, this is where you can find it. If you are looking for somewhere you can express your pro-vegan, pro-climate beliefs without judgment, this is it. If you want to abolish animal agriculture, prevent catastrophic climate change, and save our embattled planet from imminent destruction, you are in the right place. Please stay tuned. We will advance to our first speaker momentarily, but not before I remind you. The vegan climate movement needs you. The animals need you, and Earth most certainly needs you. Without further ado, let me introduce you, or rather let Chance introduce you to our keynote speaker for today, Dave Luganbiel.
For 20 years, Dave Luganbiel has been the principal teacher for Ahamsa Acres, an affiliate of the Thich Nhat Hanh Foundation. He has taught both Eastern and Western philosophy classes for 40 years in public colleges and universities in California and Oregon. He is a Buddhist mediation teacher and also the Eugene, Oregon chapter leader for Dharma Voices for Animals, environmental editor for American Vegan Magazine for 7 years, director of Ahamsa Acres Educational Center, which you can find at www.ahamsaacres.org, and the author of The Wisdom of the Buddha, Using Mindfulness to Change Your Life, as well as a blog by the same name. He is the author of more than 50 published articles and given numerous speaking engagements. You can contact him at ahimsaacres@gmail.com. These links will be sent in the chat. As our keynote speaker this year, Dale will deliver a high-level overview speech titled Personal Food Choices, Climate Change, and the Environment that explores the myriad ways animal agriculture harms the environment. This presentation will discuss a range of topics which include the inefficiency and waste of animal sources, manure pollution, fish farming, pet food, grass-fed versus factory farmed animal foods, climate change impact of food choices, why we think animal food are necessary for health, how we can make a difference, whether we see it or not, and mechanics of making the change to a plant-based diet. Please welcome Dale Luganbiel.
Thank you, Chance, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here this morning. I have quite a bit I want to share with you, so let's jump right in with the first slide. That's the introductory slide. Let's go to the next one. I need to make one adjustment on my screen so I can see what you're seeing. If you're like most people, you're deeply concerned about climate change and environmental destruction. But what can one person actually do? Next. You can do a lot actually to make a difference by making different choices at the personal level. And because we don't need to elect new politicians, enact new laws, we can make those different choices now. Next. There are lots of things that we can do to make a difference. The size of our house, the kind of transportation we use, the amount of electronic gadgetry we buy, how we heat our water, our homes, how we wash our clothes and dry them, and many other things. Next. But there's something that's often missing, perhaps the biggest choice of all, and it's often completely overlooked. It's our personal day-to-day food choices. What I choose to eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. Next. Food is big. Americans spend more than $1 billion a year on food, which is approximately double what is spent on all U.S. military expenses in a year. Next. There are 5 components of our food choices that impact the environment and climate change. The first one is whether we're eating a plant-based diet or not. The second one has to do with whether our foods are locally produced. The third has to do with whether the foods that we eat are minimally processed, more in their whole form. Minimal packaging is also important, and so is organic. Next. But eating locally, for example, is not nearly as effective as changing to a plant-based diet. In fact, a plant-based diet is at least 8 times more powerful against climate change than any of the other 4 options that were just mentioned. Next. This is kind of a useful example that compares the difference between ordering an 8-ounce steak for lunch or an 8-ounce dish of spaghetti with tomato sauce. If I have the steak, it takes 6 to 8 pounds a week. If I have the spaghetti, it takes only a half a pound a week. The steak, somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 gallons of water. For the spaghetti, only 5 gallons of water. For the steak, 75 units of fossil fuel. For the spaghetti, only 1 unit of fossil fuel energy and a corresponding reduction in greenhouse gases. Next. Now, what is the reason that choosing a steak creates a hugely greater amount of environmental damage compared to pasta? Next. Steak fundamentally is a second-hand food, and by far the best food change we can make for the environment is to reduce or eliminate our habit of eating food secondhand. Next. But what does secondhand food actually mean here? On the surface, it doesn't really sound very good because it sounds like someone else ate my food before I ate it. And that's exactly what it is. Next slide. Meat, dairy, and eggs are produced by taking food crops, corn, oats, wheat, beans, that people could eat, and feeding those crops to cattle, pigs, and chicken instead. And we then eat those crops secondhand when we eat the animal's flesh, milk, or eggs. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at how this works. This shows the fate of U.S. food crops in the United States. Over 90% of the corn, barley, and oats that are grown in this country are not eaten by people. They're eaten by livestock. Over 92% of the soybeans, over 24% of the wheat, and if you add it all up, of all the food crops that are produced in this country, 50% are not eaten by human beings. They're eaten by cows, pigs, and chickens. When I first came across this information some years ago, I was quite shocked. I remember taking a car trip cross country as a child with my family and driving through Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and seeing mile after mile of cornfields. And my assumption was, as a child, that that corn would be eaten by people, but was shocked to find, as an adult, that this is not true. And as it turns out, as I looked into this further, this information has actually been around for a long time. It's not something we just figured out. I first encountered the information in a book by Francis Moore LaFay called Diet for a Small Planet, published in 1971. This information is not even particularly controversial. You can get it from the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, state governments, and major universities. But we typically don't know this information because almost all of the information we get about food comes from the food industry itself. There's a lot of money to be made by selling animal source foods and also from selling crops to feed to livestock. So animal food industries don't have any incentive to tell us how enormously wasteful this truly is. In addition, the animal food industries donate heavily to environmental groups such as Greenpeace and Sierra Club and many others. And these organizations don't want to lose their financial base, so they don't say much about the impact of animal agriculture. So on our next slide here, we get some information about, if we could back up one, please. We get some information about how much protein you can produce. I'm having a little trouble reading the slides, unfortunately. I'm having some graphics that are overlapping at the top and bottom sometimes. So I apologize for the hesitation here. But this one tells us how much protein you can produce from a good acre of farmland, and it varies a lot depending on what you're growing. So if I'm growing soybeans on my 1 acre, I can produce 356 pounds of protein. If it's rice, it's 265. If it's legumes, it's 192. As soon as we drop into animal food sources, animal sourced food, the number drops drastically. For milk, it's only 82 pounds, eggs 78, and average for meat of all kinds is 48 pounds, and if we're using our acre to grow beef, we can only produce 20 pounds of protein. Next. This graphic shows how much land it takes somewhere in the world combined to produce food for one person on a continuing basis. So if I'm eating what we think of as the typical American diet, a combination of plant and animal source foods, somewhere in the world I'm going to need a total of 3¼ acres of land to produce my food. If I were to make a different personal choice and decide to eat a plant-based diet and include dairy as well, the amount of land drops to 1/3 of an acre. Only 10% of the land is required. And if I were willing to go a little further and make a different choice to eat a 100% plant-based diet, the amount of land that's required is only 1/6 of an acre, or 5% of the land that we're using now. Next slide. To produce 1 pound of edible food, if it's meat, requires 2,500 gallons of, and I really can't see what I have at the top here, 2,500 gallons of water. If I'm interested in making cheese, a pound of that takes 610 calories. And again, when I drop into animal source foods, the total is always much lower. 68 gallons for tofu, 40 for potatoes, 37 for soy milk, and 28 for broccoli. Next slide, please. Cow's milk, 966 gallons of water in, 1 gallon of cow's milk out. Not very efficient. This one I think is particularly powerful. It tells us how much water it takes to produce food for one day for one person such as yourself. If you're eating the standard American diet, it takes 4,200 gallons of water every day just to produce your food. Make a change in your diet, eating plants and some dairy now, the total drops to 1,200 gallons a day. By making that one choice, one person, it saves 3,000 gallons of water a day. If you're eating a totally plant-based diet, which makes sense to me, it's only 300 gallons a day. Next. There's a huge amount of water that's used in what's called fracking, which is a way of processing fossil fuels that are underground to make natural gas and other petroleum products. It takes about 140 billion gallons of water per year to run that process. As bad as that is, next slide, please. It doesn't compare to animal agriculture. Our 140 billion gallons of water per year for fracking doesn't even register as a bar on this pair of bar graphs because it's totally dwarfed by the 340,000 billion gallons of water that are used for animal agriculture. Next. Once I can read through the overlay on my screen, this tells me that it takes 40 units of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 unit of protein. Thinking ratios here. I can produce the same amount of protein if it's coming from wheat or corn. I'm going to get rid of one of the overlays right now. It only requires 2 units of fossil fuel, an enormous reduction. If the protein is coming from soybeans, only 1 unit, 1/40th of the energy needed to produce that amount of protein. Next, please. Here's an interesting sort of thought experiment. If everyone replaced the beef that they eat with beans, the result would be we become very, very close in the US to meeting our 2020 greenhouse gas emissions goals pledged at the 2009 climate talks in Copenhagen. And this is true even if people kept eating chicken, pork, eggs, and cheese in the same amounts as now. Next slide. Here's a way of putting this in some sort of personal perspective. If you take 5 showers a week, each shower is 5 minutes long, and your flow rate is 4 gallons per minute, you'll use 2,500 gallons of water in 6 months. So you could save 2,500 gallons of water by not showering at all for 6 months, kind of an ugly thought, or you could produce the same result by not eating 1 pound of beef and save the same 2,500 gallons of water. Moving on to animal manure, subject that at some point in my life I never thought I'd be particularly interested in, but I've gotten so. Animal waste in the US amounts to over 2 billion tons annually, which is equivalent to the waste of 2 billion people, 7 times the US population. None of these animals are using toilets or sewage treatment systems, and so it all ends up on the ground. Concentrations of 10,000 to 300,000 animals in one feedlot produces more fertilizer than surrounding farmland can possibly use, and it's not economical to transport it, with the result that most of the sewage ends up in the water systems we depend on. The contribution of livestock to water pollution, more than 10 times that of people, more than 3 times that of all other industries combined, which includes pretty messy industries, including coal and petroleum and plastic and so on. And this is not just about beef. It's chicken, it's pork, it's dairy, and it's eggs too. North Carolina has 9 million hogs. These hogs produce 40 million tons of raw sewage annually, which is stored in what the industry calls lagoons, which frequently have spills or get sprayed on land near human neighborhoods. This is the yearly amount of raw sewage produced by 40 million people. Next. So we might ask, is fish any better? 40% of US fish is factory farmed. Salmon, tuna, and sea bass are among the primary fish that are used for food in this country, and they're all carnivores, which means, which plays itself out as ships going to sea, burning fossil fuel, emitting greenhouse gases to catch wild fish to feed to fish that are in captivity, with a conversion ratio of 3 to 5 pounds of wild-caught fish to produce just 1 pound of fish that humans eat. Very, very, very inefficient. 5 million people live in Scotland, and Scottish fish factory farms produce the manure equivalent of 9 million people. And again, this manure is simply released, in this case, untreated, into the ocean. This is something I've gotten interested in just recently, the impact of pets in terms of climate change. Turns out, when I looked into it, there are 163 million cats and dogs in the United States. US dogs and cats' yearly food consumption has the same carbon footprint as driving 13.6 million cars for an entire year. And as we know, chicken, pork, and beef are the primary ingredients in most pet foods. US dogs and cats consume as much food as the population of France, a country of about 64 million people, so it's quite significant. A study done sponsored by World Watch found that over 51% of all worldwide annual greenhouse gas emissions are due to the raising of livestock, meaning cattle, pigs, chickens, and the industry that provides them with crops to eat. Cattle population back in 1992 well outweighed the human population and still does, using 24% of all the land mass on Earth. Now, most of what we've heard about greenhouse gases has to do with carbon dioxide. And we should be hearing a lot about carbon dioxide. It's very important. But there are other greenhouse gases that we hear very little about that are also very important. Methane, which is produced by ruminants, such as cattle, is 86 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. Nitrous oxide, which is produced by the manure of many livestock animals raised for food, is 296 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Next. Cattle worldwide produce 150 billion gallons of methane every day. It comes out in the form of flatulence, and it comes out in the form of belching. Next. Now imagine if cows were a country. If cows were a country, cattle would rank third in the world in the production of greenhouse gases. Only China and the US produce more, with what we might call the Republic of Cows producing only 6% less than the US. So some people might suggest, well, isn't grass-fed beef better than the stuff that's produced on feedlots, feeding corn and soybeans and so on? Let's take a look. Grass-fed cattle live longer. Grain-fed factory farmed animals slaughter weight is considered to be 15 months. Grass-fed cattle reach what's called slaughter weight at 23 months or so. So they live about 50% longer and continue to produce nitrous oxide, methane, and CO2 for all of that additional time. Next. In addition, grass-fed cattle, because of their diet, produce 60% to 400% more methane per day than grain-fed cattle raised on factory farms. Next. Also, because of their diet, being grass-fed, these cattle are leaner, which means it would take an additional 50 million cattle to provide the same amount of meat, same amount of beef, as is currently provided by grain-fed cattle. Next. Is it even possible to produce all meat that's consumed in this country from grass-fed animals? It takes about 11.7 acres to produce the 209 pounds of meat eaten by the average American each year. U.S. population is about 314 million people. So when we do the math, we find it takes 3.7 billion acres to provide this amount of meat from grass-fed cattle. But there are only 1.9 billion acres in the entire United States, and that's the lower 48. And next, half of the land in the US is already being used for animal agriculture. And in addition, much of the remaining land is not usable for this purpose. It has cities built on it, it's mountaintops, it's deserts, some other kind of land, not useful for that purpose. This is a good summary graphic that compares the omnivore diet and 100% plant-based diet. So if we look at what's on the right-hand side of this graphic, the plant-based diet produces only 50% of the carbon dioxide, uses 9% of the petroleum, only 8% of the water, and only 5% of the land as compared to an omnivore diet. Next slide, please. Nature simply does not care about your political affiliation or your religion, your race, your nationality, your social standing, your wealth, education, or anything else about yourself you may think is important. Climate change and degradation of the environment are not partisan issues. Next. It's just not reasonable to ask our planet to support 7.7 billion people and increasing, 1.5 billion cattle, and 1 billion sheep, plus 23 billion chickens and 677 million pigs. Next slide, please. Okay, this brings us to, I think, the end of all we have time for today. This is actually part one of a three-part presentation. If you're interested in having a copy of this presentation, all three parts, please email me and I'll be happy to send it to you for free. There's an email at the bottom of the screen, ahimsaacres@gmail.com. Thank you very much for attending, and I'm looking forward to the rest of our presenters today.
Thank you, Dale, very much for giving such an insightful presentation that outlines at a very high level just how devastating animal agriculture is and how devastating the standard American diet is relative to a plant-based vegan diet. We will now advance to our next speaker, unless, did you want any, we could make time for one question.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, whoever writes the first question gets it. And other speakers will make sure to give you a full 30 minutes, don't worry. Well, minus maybe 2 minutes of introducing you. I do know that someone was talking about dairy. They think that some of your slides are inconsistent. One of them shows a vegetarian diet being approximately as environmentally impactful as a vegan diet. Oh, okay, so we got a question. Do you have any plans to incorporate awareness programs in South Asia?
No, I'm working locally, but I'm thinking globally.
Well, thank you for the very concise answer. We will now move on to our next speaker, Harold Brown. Harold Brown was raised on a cattle farm in Michigan as a fifth-generation farmer. He lived the typical farm life, surrounded by farmed animals and wildlife once he hunted. He once hunted, rather. After a series of life events, he became vegan 33 years ago, leaving the animal business behind. Since then, he has become an animal, environmental, and justice advocate. He will deliver a poignant speech titled Being Vegan in the 21st Century, which traces veganism from the ancient Greeks to the environmental crises of today. As Harold will discuss, the principles of veganism are not new. They can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. But what does it mean to be vegan here and now? With the framework of the extended definition of veganism, we can see that while some things have changed, so much more has as well, including the increased use of animals, the further encroachment into wild habitats, and the climate crisis. We will explore our place in the world and the intersection of how we promote justice and peace in the world. Please welcome Harold Brown.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for putting this event on. It's so important. Well, I'll get right to it. In 2006, Al Gore stated in the documentary An Inconvenient Truth that first and foremost, the climate crisis was a moral question. He was right, but then I took his position with a grain of salt, since he raises Black Angus on his property in Tennessee. But he was not wrong on this point. Like Kyle mentioned, this whole idea of the use of animals and the moral and ethical questions connected to it go back to the ancient Greeks. A scholar, a friend of Lee Hall's and mine, who passed away a few years, Rin Berry, has written a book on this very topic. And the ancient Greek academies, whether it was Aristotle, Pythagoras, Socrates, and so on, those academies required you to eat a plant-exclusive diet. And a lot of people don't know that, and a lot of classical academics won't admit it, but it's the way it was. And it was because of the moral questions connected to it, but they also found from observation that the students did better academically by eating a plant-based diet, or I should say plant-exclusive diet. So this is not a new idea, and it goes through time, whether it's the ancient Chinese, it's found in Buddhism or Hinduism. But let's pause to consider how we got into this mess to begin with. Approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, humans first domesticated plants and animals. Early humans figured out how to selectively breed plants and animals for desired characteristics. Thus, the auroch became both beef and dairy cattle. Grains and pulses were developed to feed an ever-growing population of human primates. But the phenomena of this new knowledge of reproduction led to something else. The males of our species perhaps felt threatened by the ability of females of all species to create life. Remember, they didn't have an inkling of knowledge about biology. According to women working in archaeology and other fields, we are coming to a new understanding of the impact of domestication. Agriculture, which began in the Fertile Crescent, also created permanent settlements, later villages, and later cities. Arguably, it gave rise to hierarchies. We now have a better picture of the timeline of human civilization and see that the architects of these new hierarchies were men. Evidence shows that many of these early indigenous societies were matriarchal or at the least egalitarian. To this day, we see indigenous peoples that are still matriarchal or egalitarian. The bottom line is that domestication changed everything. In my opinion, domestication is an often overlooked nexus. Not only did it alter the female-male dynamic, but also property ownership, cultural formation, societal norms, as well as a devaluation of the feminine. The present state we find ourselves in is the monetization of everything. This general cultural consensus of accepted norms could be considered manufactured consent disguised as freedom of choice. Since then, humans have been on the food-producing roller coaster. In our collective wake, other species and other plants have paid a heavy price. Today, others will speak in more detail on the devastating damage and harms done to the animals on the planet. Being a former animal farmer, the core of my concern is the moral evolution of humankind. But I cannot help myself from sharing a few things about agribusiness. So the latest information I've dug up is how many animals just in the United States are slaughtered for food. So according to USDA, 900,000 cows, 1.4 million goats, 1.7 million sheep, 3.8 million pigs, 11.8 million ducks, 202 million chickens, and hundreds of millions of fish. Collectively, the beef industry has a slick messaging machine. It works on these three tactics: confuse, defend, and downplay. In my opinion, in the end, it is a giant gaslighting campaign. For those who think that lab-grown meat may be the answer, think again. These startups still can't find a better nutrient for cell development than fetal bovine serum. If you don't know what that is, it's blood or serum taken from unborn calves from female cows when they're taken to slaughter. And the carbon footprint of running the bioreactors, etc., is huge. My biggest problem with lab meat is that it doesn't address the need for moral evolution. It may abate some folks' concerns, but in general, most consumers have no tangible connection to the beings they consume, and therefore empathy is missing. Then there is the new technology of introducing beef protein into romaine lettuce. This way, people can have their salad and animal protein at the same time. But remember, it's still flesh. It will still carry the long-term health consequences. Again, the moral question is sidestepped. And if you have questions about this romaine lettuce beef protein thing, happened to Cornell. The startup is in Ithaca, Michigan, and you can email me for more information about that. The one talking point that agribusiness comes back to is efficiency. They are constantly manure washing their version of environmental stewardship. Last year, it was reported that Smithfield Farms is responsible for spilling nearly 7.5 million gallons of hog waste across the state of Missouri. This waste enters not only the water table that humans rely on, but spills into other rivers and tributaries, killing even more wildlife and creating aquatic dead zones. Shefali Sharma, the director of the European Office of IATP, or the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, says equating efficiency with climate progress is a mistake. Quote, "The climate does not care about efficiency. It requires absolute emissions reductions," she says. Decreasing emissions per liter or gallon of milk, while ever increasing the total amount of milk produced, is not going to get us there. So the dairy industry needs to dramatically rethink its model of production and growth and basically go to zero. Animal agribusiness is the leading cause of climate change. Professor Natalie Mahowald of Cornell University said, quote, "What we are seeing this year is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of what we expect to happen." Mahowald said, "If we do not halt global warming soon, then the extreme events we see this year will pale against the ones that are to come," end quote. It was reported 2 weeks ago that conditions on Earth may be moving outside the, quote, "safe operating space," end quote, of humanity. According to dozens of scientists, and these scientists list animal agriculture as the leading cause of climate change. Scientists right now are funded to the tune of $20 million per year to come up with ways to rebuild the Arctic ice caps. So far, they've presented a floating sand that would be sprayed over the ocean to reflect the sun's rays back into space. Or another idea involves pumping ocean water back up from the surface to the surface during the winter so it freezes when the temperatures drop below 50 degrees below zero. Not once suggesting that going plant exclusive will also help to rebuild the polar ice caps. Surprised? Not me. Since I started talking, and this is sad, in the time of what I've shared with you so far, there have been 2,800,000 animals killed for food in the US alone. This figure becomes even more shocking when you stretch that over 23 million per day. And according to one estimate, 200 million land animals are slaughtered around the world every single day. And in comparison, to kind of contrast that, if we were killing humans at the same rate we are killing animals worldwide, the entire population of the planet would be wiped out in 17 days. I'm always brought back to my friend Will Anderson and his book, This is Hope, Green Vegans and the New Human Ecology. In this well-written book, Will explains how humans, through our hubris, have become not just an apex predator on the planet, but the mega predator. But he lays out a way forward. The new human ecology is basically this: you, me, everyone. Lower human population, social and economic justice, equitable, sustainable use of resources, healthy, recovering ecosystems, empathy, compassion, love, steady state, sustainable economic systems, and a vegan human ecology. I recommend reading this book. This book does give us hope in a way forward. And I would my talk is going to be a little short because I don't like talking at people. I like talking with people. So I'll wrap up by saying, and by sharing with you about something I think most vegans can relate to. Many of us feel the trauma and pain not only of the beings being exploited by humans, but also the planet. Sometimes others will say things like, "You're too sensitive," or You're being over sentimental, related to our feelings and thinking of the many issues that lay before us. For those of us who do feel these things deeply, it is known as being a highly sensitive person or an HSP. And here are some of the markers for being a highly sensitive person. And some of these may resonate with you. Highly sensitive people are naturally more empathetic and caring to the need of others, people, animals, and the planet in our cases. Highly sensitive people are trusted by their peers because of their honesty and conscientiousness. Highly sensitive people notice little details that others might miss. Highly sensitive people are very creative and can appreciate things at a deeper level. Highly sensitive people have more insight into their mental and emotional processes. We are not out of control, because that is a criticism, that because we feel things more deeply, that we don't have control of our emotions. Highly sensitive people feel more connected to the world around them. And highly sensitive people feel positive emotions more deeply. Nawal Mustafa, PhD, reminds us, quote, being a highly sensitive person is not a disorder. I am a strong advocate for accepting ourselves for who we are as we are. Being aware of what parts of us need work and actively healing them is always encouraged, but I don't think we should ever shame ourselves for being a certain way, end quote. Being a highly sensitive person can be challenging, mainly because we live in a highly insensitive society, or HIS. I say take comfort for being a highly sensitive person, for the planet, animals, and people need us more than ever. I found that being a vegan is striving to be more morally consistent. Am I perfect at it? Of course not, but no one is. But I try every moment to be better than I was, to the benefit of others, the planet, and the animals. As Gandhi said, a principle is a principle, and in no case can it be watered down because of our incapacity to live it in practice. We have to strive to achieve it, and the striving should be conscious, deliberate, and hard. We can help be the moral compass for now and the future. We can be the way forward. I leave you with the Buddhist meditation. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be liberated. Thank you. Now, if there are any questions, Kyle, I guess I'll rely on you to read them out, and I'll do my best to give coherent answers.
Absolutely. I will keep an eye out. Chance, would you also like to help with the questions, or do you want me to do it for this segment? Please enter questions in the chat. We have some time. We have a significant amount of time, in fact, for Q&A.
About 10 minutes. Keep this train on time.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Paloma Ibarra. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. And they ask, was it hard to transition from rancher to vegan, or from a rancher to vegan?
Yes, it was in certain ways, but not. It was basically because of resistance from the community I grew up in and my family. But it was a kind of a gradual transition because it came from a health crisis I had. And then watching my family, my father in particular, dying of what I suffered from. And so it was purely out of self-interest for the first few years. But then as I gathered information and I understood and learned how to reverse my illness, which was heart disease, then that's when I, started to really put the pieces together. I do say that for the first few years of my life, you could say I was introduced to being vegan for 33 years. Well, yeah, I was on a plant exclusive diet from 1990 to 1995. But in 96, my interaction with from 95 to 96, my interaction with a steer at a sanctuary changed my life. So I had all of this information in my head about nutrition. I studied that rigorously because I wanted to make good choices, and I had good mentors and good doctors to guide me along the way. But this whole idea of animal sentience and so on was foreign to me, and it was wisdom I had, but I had tamped down because these are things you observe as a child on a farm, but you shut away because you can't allow yourself that emotional connection and do the work you have to do. And so when I had this interaction with Snickers at the sanctuary, that was when I had this like head full of information, and I've been reading animal theory and animal philosophy, and all of a sudden, boom, my heart got connected to all of that. And that's when I became what I consider a more mature activist, because my head and heart were now working in unison. And that's when my life really took off and changed. So, but as I learned more in my evolution, my moral evolution and my emotional evolution progressed, that created more and more distance between the community I left, because in rural America, we do not teach males to be emotionally honest. We do not teach males to be, well, being morally ambiguous is really encouraged. Moral honesty isn't encouraged. So, yeah, it was tough, but I went from my biological family to my chosen family. Life got a lot easier real quickly. So the vegan community embraced me, even though I was scared to death to let anybody know where I came from the first 4 or 5 years. I thought I was going to get judged, and all this programming I had from being on the other side of the fence, literally. But then when I came out, then I was embraced, and I haven't looked back.
Thank you for that very heartfelt response. Now we have another question you might find amusing. Do you still talk to Oprah?
Oh, that's Howard Lyman.
And that's the next thing. How many people have mistaken you for Howard Lyman, and how do you feel about that?
Oh, Howard's a good friend of mine. He was actually the person who got me out of my shell to talk about being a former farmer when I met him in a conference. So, yeah, and the other problem is Howard Harold. Two not very common names. Howard's more common than Harold. So I think it's a more common name, starts with an H. So many people call me Howard. That's fine, but yeah, that's his story. That's his gig, and yeah, never met Oprah.
Absolutely. And I must admit that I was one of the people whose initial impression was connected to Howard Lyman. So it's this elision is happening for a reason. A lot of people are associating your name with Howard Lyman. But anyway, you're Harold and you're awesome too. So the next thing isn't so much a question, it's a comment. And it reads as follows from Simon Purser. There definitely needs to be more support for farmers to transition away from animal agriculture and open their heart to compassion for our fellow animals. Harold has a beautiful soul and so glad to have heard his talk. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me. Yeah, you're seeing more and more farmers. Not a lot, but you're seeing more farmers who are making this connection. And like, I think his name is first name's Paul, his last name's Comer. Was a pig farmer, hog farmer, and he transitioned away from it. And I do what I can to connect with farmers that want to make that transition to, a plant-based agricultural system and get out of the agribusiness business. And important distinction here. Agriculture and agribusiness are two different things. Agribusiness incorporates animals. Okay, this is my nerdy English linguistics background from college. The etymology of agriculture is literally cultivation of plants. It has nothing to do with animals. Agriculture has nothing to do with animals. But being English speakers, we're exceedingly lazy in how we use our words. So well, I think as a movement, we do much better whenever we talk about anything involved with or connected to the raising, growing, and the use of animals. It'd be called agribusiness, not agriculture, because the people in veganics, they're the ones that have to lay claim to agriculture, because that is actually what they're doing. It's not, and they're not a part of agribusiness. I'm off my soapbox.
Absolutely. Thank you for the clarification. There's one final question that we'll get to for today. It's been asked a couple times. What happened to the animals that you had on your ranch? Was it a last pig or 73 cows type situation?
No, it was a situation where my brother and I were going to be taking over the farm, but we kind of butted heads about all of that and how it was going to happen. And and for some other reasons too, it just got too stressful, and I just packed it in and left. And with basically no direction. And I moved to all places. I went from a farm to living in Cleveland, Ohio for 13 years and worked as a mechanic. So that's where my evolution started, is when I moved to Cleveland and the community I met there.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Harold, for sharing so much of your insight with us today. Our next speaker is Hope Bohannic, and Chance will introduce her momentarily.
Hope has been active in animal protection and environmental activism for over 30 years. She is a published author, grassroots activist, host of the Hope for the Animals podcast, and the executive director of Compassionate Living, a vegan advocacy organization. She will deliver an eye-opening speech titled "Greenwashing Our Food: Sustainable Labels Won't Save the Planet." This startling expose will reveal just how flimsy many of the marketing terms used to greenwash meat are for both the animals and the planet. After all, this is a new awareness around the, there is a new awareness around the, my apologies, around the impact of agriculture and our food have on not only our climate disruption, not only the climate disruption, but also land use, biodiversity, deforestation, water use, water pollution, and so much more. Most of us have heard that meat is bad for the environment, but what about grass-fed, free-range, or local animal products? Are sustainably labeled animal products the better choice? Hope will share what she has learned from studying decades of peer-reviewed and scientific research to help you make the best decision for the planet and the animals. Please welcome Hope Bohannic.
All right. Thank you very much, Chance, for that introduction. And thank you, Kyle, for having me. I hope everyone can hear me. If not, someone let me know. And I've got my slides up, so that all worked. Love it when the technology comes together. And thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So just a little about me. I have been vegan for 34 years. And I actually started way back then as an environmental activist. That was what drew me into activism. My very first job was with Greenpeace. I actually worked with Earth First, doing tree sits in my more radical days back in the 90s, doing tree sits and logging road lockdowns in the Pacific Northwest. So the environmental impact, the environmental aspect of this is very, very near and dear to my heart. And, it was what drew me into activism and caring about this planet. But the farmed animals were just calling me. And I transitioned to working with, doing vegan education and working for farmed animal justice. But the environmental impact is still there and is still critical and still been so important to me. So I've actually written 2 books on the subject of humane washing, and some people call it the humane myth, inspiration from Harold Brown, who we just heard from. The humane myth, is been in the ethos of our animal advocacy. I call it the humane hoax. It's basically humane washing. In both my books, both The Ultimate Betrayal is my first book. My second book is this one that you see on the screen, The Humane Hoax, that just came out in the spring. It's an anthology with 18 amazing essays. And in both my books, I have an extensive greenwashing section, the environmental impact. So, and we're seeing it's so frustrating, having been shouting this from the rooftops for 30 years, and seeing now the impact worldwide. I mean, and I'm living in it myself in the Pacific Northwest. I was in Northern California for the last 30 years, and the smoke and the fires, it's just gotten, I mean, it's almost unlivable now. And it's not, it used to be this kind of just like 3 months at the end of the summer was the fire season. Now it's just pretty much year round that there can be these huge fires, smoke for weeks, just choking the entire area. The air, everybody's got their air quality apps, right? And it's often in the purple and like the worst air quality. We actually moved to Oregon to get out of the smoke and fires of the Bay Area. And it's, been a horrible summer up here. We had a week of smoke and fires up here in Eugene, Oregon. So, you can't get away from it. It's horrible what we're doing to this planet. And wow, there is a very low cost, easy solution that we're going to be talking about today, right? So, and I'll get into that a little more, but for the first time ever, this is interesting, there was a poll done just recently that found that the majority of people in the US feel that they are directly affected by climate change. So that's good. We're making progress. I mean, how can you not? You're looking out your window and seeing it, the fires, the floods, everything. So just touching on the big picture of this thing. And Dale did our first speaker did an incredible job of an overview of the big picture. So according to the Environmental Protection Agency and many, many, many other scientific studies, but this is just kind of what I pulled from them, the animal agriculture causes climate change and is a huge cause, right? A major factor in massive energy use, deforestation, loss of habitat, biodiversity, species loss, water waste, water pollution, air pollution, topsoil erosion. It goes on and on. And also wasting of food and grain and resources. So what do we do about it? I mean, we know that animal agriculture, and it's coming to light in the media now more. So we know that these things are happening. What do we do, right? Well, the industry is telling you what to do. The industry is offering something. I'm talking about the animal agriculture industry and animal food production. They are offering some solutions, right? In the form of sustainable labels. We're seeing local and organic and grass-fed and free range and all these labels now that are meant to appease consumers, right? So I want to look at that. This is what is often called greenwashing. It's some of these labels are just straight greenwashing, right? There's just no significant change in the environmental impact or no change at all. Some situations may be slightly better, but then others are so problematic that they can be even worse. So we're gonna talk about this. I'm gonna break down some of these labels, and just keeping in mind as we go through this that these labels are woefully unregulated. I mean, they are, the regulating systems for these labels is either non-existent or so, kind of rotating door. Basically, the farmer, whatever the farmer says, there's no on-site inspection, there's no one coming to the farm to check, whatever, it's kind of whatever he says, and the USDA or FDA or whoever approves these labels. Some of these labels don't even, you don't even have to have some approval. They will just rubber stamp it, right? So keeping that in mind. But, and also I definitely want to mention the size of the farm. So this is something that is kind of, we have this thought, people have this thought that, well, if this farm is smaller, then it's going to be better environmentally, right? At least it's a small farm. Well, a smaller farm doesn't alter the amount of resources and water and things like that that it takes to raise and transport and slaughter billions of animals. Right now, we have 55% of our fresh water, the US's fresh water, going to animal agriculture, going to water the animals as well as to raise the grain that is fed to the animals. That wouldn't change just because that water is being used on smaller farms. It doesn't matter, right? So there's a lot of different reasons I don't have time to get into that, smaller doesn't necessarily mean better. And also, when you're seeing these labels, it does not necessarily mean that it is a smaller farm, right? Because some of these farms, especially organic, are just huge. They're these big conglomerates and they're still using these labels. So keeping all that in mind, we're going to move on to organic. This is the first one I'm going to talk about. So the organic label, the reason I like to start with organic is because this is the one label of all the ones that I'm going to be talking about that actually does have some rigorous oversight, that does have some, there's on-site inspection of the farm. The farmer has to go through a great deal of hoops to get this certification, and so there is some oversight going on here, and some definitely some benefits, right, to the environment. But when we are talking about animal products, okay, so when we're specifically talking about organic eggs, organic dairy, organic meat, the only difference is that the grain fed to the animals is organic. The only difference from conventional is that the grain that's fed to the animals is organic, and the animals are essentially drug-free. Okay, that's really the two big things that the organic certification is looking at, right? There's also some regulation about access to the outside, animals having access to the outside. That is incredibly industry friendly. Oftentimes it's just cows that have to have, like, are forced to have access to the outside. Well, guess what? Most dairy operations and beef operations, the animals are outside and moving around because they're large. They have to move to move to different paddocks, that kind of thing. So, but then chickens often do not have to have access to the outside under organic regulations. Why? Because often, and most, 99%, are not being kept outside. Most are kept in windowless warehouses inside. So again, it's very industry friendly for that's for the chickens, with the access to the outside thing. But anyway, all the other detrimental impacts that I had in that first slide, going down all those things that we talked about, they still apply to organic agriculture, especially animal agriculture. Applying, and that's what I'm talking about today. I'm going to, let me clarify that organic plant farming is absolutely wonderful. I buy only organic with plants and vegetable farming. What I'm talking about is animal products, okay? And this chart should help to clarify. So with this chart, what we have here is we have 3 diets. We've got the vegan diet at the top, vegetarianism in the middle, and the standard American diet, meat, dairy, and eggs down at the bottom, right? And the top light green line is organic farming. The second line, the darker line underneath it, is conventional farming. And if you go down to the very bottom of your screen and see that dark green line going across the bottom, that is the standard American diet. That's what most people are eating, is a diet that includes meat, dairy, and eggs and is not organic. Okay. So let's say someone says, you know, I really want to green my diet. I really want to eat more eco. I'm going to buy all organic. I'm going to buy organic dairy and organic meat. Okay, well, that you know, that helps a bit. You're going to drop to that long light green line, and you've reduced your impact by 8%. Okay, that's something. But let's say that same person says, you know, I really want to eat more eco. I want to eat more ecologically. I'm going to go vegan. And now we're not even talking organic, just eating vegan. Okay, now we drop down to that dark green line up at the top in the vegan diet, and you have reduced your impact by 87%. Now we're talking, right? That is significant impact, significant reduction, and you can take it all the way to organic vegan and drop your impact by 94%. So, and this goes along with what Dale was saying. Dale was saying in the beginning of his presentation that, you know, there's lots of ways you can reduce your impact with food, like less packaging and local and all this kind of thing. But what you'll find again and again is that the vegan component, the plant-based component, going plant-based, going vegan, actually has, I believe he said, 8 times more impact than all those other things. So that this kind of shows that, right? Okay, let's move on to local. So local, wow, this is getting so popular. We're seeing this label all over the place. I snapped this picture at a Whole Foods, I believe in Sacramento. And the thing with local that you have to remember is that, first of all, the definition is whatever that store or that product wants it to be. There is no, you know, federal or whatever regulation and determination of what those food miles are. You know, it's whatever they want to say. So there's that. But when you look at a food's carbon footprint, okay, how much impact a food has, how much environmental, specifically climate change impact a food has, the transport, or how local the food is, food miles, is only 11% of the equation. And the production phase is 83%. And animal products are heavy on production. That production phase is, you know, all of the energy use and the resource intenseness and the production, right? What it takes to create that product. And every time they do life cycle assessments, and that's when they calculate the impact of food for vegetable food, for plant foods, it's like seed to plate. For animal foods, inception to plate, I guess we could call it. The calculations find again and again that animal products have a much higher impact on the environment, regardless of whether they're local or sustainable or whatever, right? So again, we're seeing that it's the animal product aspect that is so impactful, and these other factors are just minimal. So animal farming takes an incredible amount of resources, and it is incredibly inefficient. Indoor environments, lighting, heating, the mechanized milking process, mechanized slaughter process, all the refrigeration, right? This is tons of fossil fuel use, tons of resources. Compared to growing plants, animal products are massively inefficient and wasteful when you compare to plant foods, which it takes so much less energy, resources, all of that. Okay. So wrapping up the local, there was a study in the Journal of Environmental Science and Technology, and it found that switching just 2 meals a week from meat and dairy to a vegetable-based diet achieves more greenhouse gas reduction than buying all locally sourced food. You know, so local, and you know, there are other reasons and good things about a local diet which can have to do with the economy and local, you know, economy, things like that. But what we're talking about right now is environmental impact of animal agriculture, and local means very little when we're talking about in that specific context, okay? Okay, let's move on to free range. So free range, pasture raised, These labels we're seeing now more, especially in eggs and other animal products. And people often think that this is more environmental, right? Why? The reason I use this picture that you see here is this is a typical cage-free operation for chickens. I have witnessed these myself in Sonoma County, California, gone up and actually looked in these places. And this is typically what you see. And, you know, not only is this a miserable and horrible existence for these poor animals, cage-free does not mean cruelty-free, I'll add that, you know, this could be considered a free range operation because all a farmer would have to do is to open a door to a tiny little, like, you know, patio, concrete patio, 5x5 area, mud hole. That's what I often saw, is just like these mud holes that were the outdoor area for these birds. And, you know, and call that cage free range, you know, call that free range. All they have to have is access to the outside, but there's no regulation on what that access looks like, how big it is, how long they have. I mean, they could be open for 5 minutes a day, you know. So my point here in all this is that there's really no difference in, you know, cage-free, free range as far as the environmental impact. Often there is no difference. But there are some operations, especially pork producers, that are offering animals some more space. First, before I go to the next slide, I just want you to think about this. So let's say this farmer did actually want to transition to pasture-based or whatever and want to give these birds some space. Okay, so this, I mean, there's probably, you know, 5,000 birds in here, possibly more. And this is maybe half an acre of space. So if this farmer wanted to give these birds even, you know, a slight semblance of some amount of space, he would need closer to, you know, 3 times, 5 times. He'd need acres and acres of land to accommodate the same amount of animals. So the land use issue is really huge. And I'm going to get into talking about that more. But, you know, basically, you know, free ranging, we can't scale it up because of the amount of land that we would have to use. We would need closer to 5 planet Earths to accommodate all the farmed animals if we truly wanted to give them the space that they need and deserve to live, you know, outdoors, right? So it's just really frustrating when we hear about this being an alternative, because if we wanted to free range animals, if we wanted these local animals, we would have to start, you know, destroying forests and wetlands and prairies and other green spaces that are sequestering carbon to accommodate all these local farms, right? And it's also been studied now, and more studies are going to be coming out, that free range increases the damage to biodiversity as these open spaces are going to have to be required for more, you know, more animals. An interesting tidbit, I hope I have the time. I'm not sure about my time, but I have so much more I want to get to, but I'm definitely going to try to fit it all in. But I definitely want to give this example. Okay, so there's a beef and pork farm in Petaluma, California, in Sonoma County, Bay Area. And they claim to give their animals 10 acres per cow and 50 acres per 10 pigs. Okay, this is on their website, right? So now we're talking about 60 acres for 11 animals, right? 60 acres for 11 animals. There are 60,000 people in Petaluma. How on earth could this be scaled up? How on earth could they feed all the people of Petaluma their meat? You know, it just cannot be done. You know, there's just not enough space. The tiny amount of free ranging of animals that we're doing now, that's all that the earth can accommodate. We cannot scale it up. This is just a specialty market for a few elite buyers, and it can't be anything more. All right, so I'm going to move on to grass-fed. Dale talked about this a bit, which I'm glad of, because, you know, why do people go for this product? Why do they look for this label? They think it's more environmental. But we are finding out now, we're learning that actually grass-fed can be even worse than conventional beef farming. And this is where I was in the beginning, I was saying that some of these labels are so problematic that they're even worse. Well, grass-fed is one of those. Grass-fed meat can produce 50 to 60% more greenhouse gas emissions than conventional beef. They also use more water because the animals are moving around, they're exercising more, they drink more water, they're actually eating more longer. So, you know, Dale got into kind of the whys of this, so I won't get into too much of the why about this, but there's just been numerous studies from Oxford and Harvard and Washington State University. They compare conventional feedlot cows to grass-fed cows, and again, they found that producing grass-fed required more land, more water, more fossil fuels. It produced more greenhouse gases. You know, I mean, it's not even neutral, it's worse. And it's just so frustrating. Okay, now there are those out there that at this point would be saying, wait, hang on. You can't just throw the cows out into the field and think everything's gonna be okay. There are methods, there are ways of doing it. And this is when you'll start hearing about regenerative animal agriculture. Okay, so regenerative animal agriculture is now the new buzz. We're going to be hearing more and more about it. This is the green shining superstar that's going to make everyone be able to eat beef, right? And I'll just explain what it is. I use this image because you could see that this whole area, you know, used to be how they would do it is they would put a bunch of cows out under this whole area for grazing. But with regenerative grazing, you know, it's called numerous different things. Rotational grazing is another, holistic management, all kinds of things. I think the industry has now honed in and decided on regenerative animal ag as the term. And what they do is they fence off. So all these lines that you're seeing on the screen, those will be fencing. So they fence off an area into numerous sections, and they use fewer animals, once again, fewer animals for the same amount of space in one area. They'll put the cows, a smaller number of cows into one area. They graze that down, and then after a few weeks, months, whatever, they move the cows to another section. They move them over to the next section, put the fence up, and supposedly this area gets regenerated. Okay. There's just way too much to this to go into the detail with this short presentation, but suffice it to say that after 4 decades of trial and error, this is not something new. This has been tried and studied for a long time. Again, scaling up is not possible, and it's not the green shining superstar that they want it to be. Peer-reviewed science is showing that this management approach is really no better than conventional. There's some variation here and there, but overall, it's not. And I will now give a plug for my podcast, Hope for the Animals podcast, because I have had a few speakers on about this. These are 2 that I'll highlight that are just really, really excellent episodes where we dig in deep to the regenerative animal ag thing. And I think it's really critical because, you know, we have the industrial talk down, right? We all know how to talk about the industrial impact, but then someone comes back with, well, but what about regenerative? You know, we've got to educate ourselves. We've got to start knowing what to say to that and why it's not so good. So these are 2 wonderful episodes. I had Nicholas Carter on. Nicholas Carter is actually one of my authors. One of the authors, he wrote an essay for the anthology, The Humane Hoax, in the greenwashing section. And then also Dr. Tushar Mehta was on. He does plantbaseddata.org, if anyone's familiar with that website. And they both did an excellent job of really breaking down the regenerative thing. So I encourage you to check out those podcasts on my, my podcast is available anywhere that you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, whatever. You can also just go directly to the website if that's easier for you, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org. And at the top, I have a drop-down menu of categorized podcasts, and you can go to the drop-down menu for environmental and select environmental, and all the podcasts that have had anything about environmental issues are there, and these 2 podcasts will be there. All right. Also, they'll just be in the all episodes section, but there's a lot there. Okay, so regenerative grazing is the equivalent of clean coal. So, you know, free-ranging animals, grass-fed, rotational grazing, all these things, it's things that people want to believe are true. They want to be able to eat their beef, and save the planet at the same time, right? But it just doesn't hold water scientifically. Okay, I can't finish or wrap up without talking about the chicken industry, because whenever we're talking about environmental issues, often we hear about the cows, we blame the cows, and people think, oh, but you know, chicken's not as bad. I'll just switch to chicken. Chicken are small, they don't have as much impact, right? It's an unfair comparison. As I say, it's like comparing rotten apples and oranges. Kyle, am I at my time? Is that?
No, I was just trying to be proactive.
Oh, okay. All
You
right. I saw
still
you. I was
have
like,
a good
okay, I ran
5
over
minutes.
time.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up quick. So, so the comparison's unfair. You know, we hear that chicken's less impactful, but that's not the case. And there's lots of reasons, but one that I'll go into is the poultry litter. So in these windowless warehouses, we've got, you know, for the chickens raised for meat, the breeder chickens, the chickens that are bred, that are used for breeding flocks, as well as cage free now, they put down this litter, this, you know, like sawdusty stuff, and it gets a buildup of all the horrible things, concentrated feces and heavy metals and chemicals and bacteria, and parasites and pathogens and viruses, and the, you know, the dead, diseased carcasses of the poor birds that didn't survive, right, the process, and it gets all bulldozed up, pushed out on the farm, goes down into the groundwater, into our waterways, and causes eutrophication of the waterways, where there is an oxygen depleted area called eutrophication in the water, that where aquatic life can't live. So, so that's just one reason. There's numerous other pollutive things about the poultry industry, but I just want to, you know, you have to think compared to what, you know, you compare beef to chicken, you know, there may be slight differences, but if you compare any of the animal products to plant farming, then you've got significant reduction in the impact on on the environment. All right, so just wrapping up, I'm gonna skip, if I only have 5 minutes, well, I'll do this quickly. What can we do? What is a solution? Regrow, rewild. This is the nature-based solution to the climate crisis. And how do we do this? By reducing the land use used by animal agriculture. Dale had a great slide about this, about the land use just being off the charts for animal agriculture. We could use that land, transition that land to more green spaces, rewild, regrow, and that would be sequestering carbon to tackle this climate crisis. So that is a great nature-based solution. I'll give another plug for my podcast, the Hope for the Animals podcast. Please check it out. I have some amazing guests. In fact, Connie Spence, who's coming up, has been on the podcast. And Meg, who is also coming up, is going to be on the podcast. Hers is coming out in October. So you can hear more from some amazing speakers today on the podcast. Just keeping in mind that cruelty-free is not, or cage-free is not cruelty-free, our Humane Hoax Project. You can check out humanehoax.org for more information, and where you can get my book is there on our website. And I'll wrap up with this quote: "We must not let the deception of new marketing eclipse the fundamental cruelty of animal agriculture," and I will add the fundamental impact of animal agriculture on the environment. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you very much, Hope. Now, Hope, you have generated a lot of conversation, but for some reason, people aren't asking many questions. Come on, everyone. I know you have to have more questions. We have a few minutes for questions, or really 1 or 2 minutes. So whoever asks the first question gets to go first. How did you calculate? Oh, Chance. Go ahead, Chance.
There was one that came in from Anne at 12:25 asking, seaweed for cows, can you discuss?
Seaweed for cows? Yeah, so there's all these crazy things that the industry is trying to do to reduce the impact just a little, you know, and seaweed is one of those where they're feeding cows seaweed because supposedly it reduces the amount of methane that they produce. and I think the numbers are something like 5% less or 2%. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And if we wanted to harvest that much seaweed to feed the billions of cows that are out there, what kind of impact would that be on our oceans? So there's a lot of problems with that. There's these other silly things that they're doing, like these masks that they're actually putting on the cows' mouths that because most of the carbon is actually from their burps. I know the farts get the laughs, but mostly from the rumination and from their mouths is where the methane is coming. And they've got these masks that they're to try to capture the methane. I mean, it's all such ridiculousness, because the impact that the reduction is so little. And when you compare it again to just going vegan, I mean, it's such a wonderful, easy solution. We wouldn't have to have massive infrastructure change, massive government involvement or anything like that. It's just making different decisions at the store and at the grocery and the restaurants. So I hope people can, realize that these gadgetry and silly solutions are just are just postponing what needs to happen, and that is a global transition to a vegan diet.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Hope. Before we move on, there is one question and a compliment that I would like to share with you. Let me draw it back up real quick. Oh no, where did it go? Hope, do you have a research team to gather the data you report? You seem inexhaustibly resourceful, which is the same impression I got from reading your book, The Ultimate Betrayal.
Well, it takes me about 10 years to get a book out. My 2 books have been out in a span of 20 years. So I've got, it's just me, but I take a long time and I do an excessive amount of research. No research team, but there are some wonderful things like plant-based data that Dr. Tushar Mehta has out there that help you with research. Sentient Media is another great resource. So, but no, I do it all myself, but it just takes me a long time to get the information out because it's just me.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Hope. And don't worry, Lee, we'll add on a couple minutes to your presentation. I would, at this juncture, like to introduce our next speaker, and their name is Lee Hall. Lee Hall has played many roles as a human primate. Most relevant here is Lee's experience as a legal officer and board member for multiple animal and environmental nonprofits, as an adjunct law professor teaching environmental, animal, and refugee law, and as author of the Non-Human Rights and Human Sustainability entry for the Encyclopedia of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Today, Lee can be found working in their studio for the art of animal liberation at www.patreon.com/Lee Hall, for which support is helpful and appreciated. Feminist, non-binary, and committed to the peace movement, Lee has positioned 40 years of vegan advocacy at intersections of gender, nationality, and species hierarchies, confronting the culture of the cage. Lee's first major talk on climate and diet was a plenary at the North American Vegetarian Society's 2004 Vegetarian Summerfest, now Vegan Summerfest. Lee continues to evolve as a climate-aware vegan. They will deliver a riveting, insightful speech titled Climate Action as Veganism, which reflects on the extraordinary climate events we have witnessed this year alone and their devastating impact on non-human communities. After this year alone, 2023, we witnessed Earth's temperatures elevated by 1.5 degrees Celsius for a sustained period, more than 1 month. Land and sea temperatures have risen to record highs, then stayed there. We read about the tragic toll this is taking in human communities worldwide. Perhaps we know less about the fierce impact it is having on non-human communities and the habitats absolutely critical to their survival. And then there are animals caged, farmed, flooded out, hunted down. What lifestyle changes does the dual crisis of global heating and species loss require for a vegan in a position to make further changes? This presentation is the story of unfolding awareness in self-rewilding. Please welcome Lee Hall.
All right. Thank you, Kyle. Can you hear? Yes, thumbs up. All right. If everybody here is going through something like I am at this particular moment, you're like letting all these wonderful talks, information-packed talks, just settle in. And there's so much here. And I want to thank everyone who has already done a presentation. And I know the presentations that are coming up the same way, how important they are to share information that everyone here today can then go and reshare. And I saw people in the chat talking about that and thanking the speakers for the information and resources so that they could do their own slideshows. And I loved seeing that. Who was it that wrote the book, Please Steal This Book? Like, please steal our slideshows and go out there into the world with what's going on today. Thank you for being here. This time, I did Climate Summit with Project Animal Freedom last year, and I did a lot of informational material in the presentation. And so I decided this year I would do something a little bit different, actually a lot different. I'm not the same person I was last year. So I thought I would sort of just take you through a story of what I'm thinking about in 2023. And my journey into kind of a self-rewilding. Other speakers have talked about rewilding already, and I want to bring this kind of to a personal experience. Harold Brown talked a lot about domestication as sort of our essential problem, right? As a human species, as Homo sapiens, what have we done to get ourselves into the messes that we have dragged the earth and its biocommunities into? And it looks like self-domestication is sort of, I don't know, we could call it the original sin. I think Jeffrey Mason calls it the original sin, domestication. So if that's the case, how could I deal with all that's going on around me in this late stage self-domestication thing that humanity is in? And how do I get myself back, as far as possible, into harmony with my biocommunity? So that's the context of this story about my personal journey this year. To start, and this is just one slide, because our other speakers have already delved into this very, very well and laid the whole framework that we all need. Veganism is climate action. And I'll give one example because lots and lots of people read the New York Times. So to see that on July 21st, 2023, the New York Times publishes an article, Save the Planet, put down that burger. And they had a graphic that went all over social media that's on the right side of the screen here. And they said that people who eat a plant, an exclusively plant diet, account for some 75% less the greenhouse gas emissions than the omnivores do. Well, that's a big deal for the New York Times to say, and it's a big deal that they made this graphic and that it went all over social media, and that it also goes into the harm and water and biodiversity all over the planet. This is where we are now. People are coming around. When I first did my first talk on climate and diet, it was 2004, it was 19 years ago. And finally, I'm starting to see that the world is catching up with us, right? And now I'm asking myself, I'm a 40-year vegan, so you feel free to criticize me for taking so long to ask certain questions. But then again, there may be a lot of people who are listening who say, well, you know, I've got a lot further to go. There's so much more that I could do. So I hope you can relate to this. This is not a criticism of others. This is just what I've said to myself. Why wasn't I thinking of some of these things earlier? And I'm saying to myself, what lifestyle changes does this dual crisis of global heating, climate chaos, and extinction and species loss require of me to, how can I make further changes? And I can. We tend to hear Harold Brown mentioned the inconvenient truth and how Al Gore didn't go all the way into the inconveniences, as a lot of people who are talking about divesting from fossil fuels don't necessarily go into the idea of a exclusively plant-based diet. And on the other hand, many of us vegans think, well, we're doing the most important thing, and that's probably true, we are. But that doesn't mean there's not more we can do. And I think that now that we're in absolute climate chaos, it just brings it home to me. What can I do? What can I do? There's more that I can do for these beings here, this family here, who are losing their habitat, the grizzlies, because of climate, because of the climate is conducive to the pine bark beetles who are eating up their food. And so they are in an utter mess, the grizzly bears of the West. What can I do? How can I help more? Talk about an utter catastrophe. You may have seen this. This BBC piece is dated the 24th of August. And what were they talking about here? Nearly 10,000 emperor penguin chicks died in Antarctica at once. And the reason is that the ice broke up beneath their feet too fast because of the warmth, because of the global heating, because of the global heating crisis. And it turns out newly hatched emperor penguin chicks actually don't have waterproof feathers yet. Fledging for them means being able to swim, but they're not hatched that way. And I asked myself, what can I do? I'm in the position to do more. Not everybody is. But I happen to work from home. And I don't have human dependence. So that makes me freer to make a number of decisions and commitments that perhaps others can't. How far can I go to rewild myself? This year, 2023, everyone probably knows this, or most everyone here is aware of this, that we witnessed Earth's temperatures elevated by 1.5 centigrade, the dreaded 1.5 C, for more than a month. So we're looking at this time of, we're on the edge, Land and sea temperatures have risen to new highs, but they didn't just rise to new highs, they stayed there. What can we do? We're vegan. And everyone who's listening, who's inspired to be vegan, and who said that in the chat, and who was looking for assistance with that, thank you for your interest and interest in making that decision and making that commitment. Thank you for being here. And I'm thinking, you know, the reality is, regardless of what percentage animal agribusiness is emitting versus what fossil fuels are emitting, It's all emitting greenhouse gases. And so the reality is our species is driving and flying and eating our way to climate breakdown. What can I do to do more than what I'm already doing as a vegan? And I saw this recently, September 22nd, this person on Twitter, and it says a lot to me. It resonates with me at this moment. As I said, in my personal journey is what I'm explaining to you today. Climate Cat says, driving isn't vegan, neither is owning cars. Drivers kill more animals, children, and elderly people than wars have and plus any other causes on Earth. Drivers are not the majority. They like to gaslight others into thinking they are. And there's we won't go into what is linked here, but it's the NewYorker.com, and it's what roads have wrought. We don't need to go there for purposes of today. You get the point. This is resonating with me. And then I also saw on social media very recently, Ronald Steenblick said, and I asked Ronald, I said, can I have your permission to post this at the Vegan Climate Summit tomorrow? This was yesterday. I put the slide in, and Ronald hit a like, so I think I got permission. And Ronald pointed out something that I wasn't really aware of. Most of the microplastics that are in the environment and that are in the digestive systems of non-human animals all over the world, most of it is from tires. That's the big issue with microplastics. There are a lot others, of course. And then saying, EVs doesn't get us out of this. EVs is sort of like a humane myth, right? Because the heavier the vehicle, for example, a heavy battery-powered vehicle like the F-150 that President Biden drives, is that the weight of that vehicle means that there's more contributions of microplastics into the environment. Again, it resonated with me. And I've been asking myself all this here, what have we become in our late stage of self-domestication? We equate freedom with boxing ourselves into these contraptions made of metal and glass. And we get in them and we push everybody else out of the way, even in national parks, even communities of animals that we value and think are very rare. We do this. And when we do this, not only is there a rudeness involved in going through their homes and pushing them out to the side, but it disconnects us from who we really are. We're animals. We're part of a bio-community on Earth. And look at how our attitudes that are manifest in the decisions of how we transport ourselves. Amphibians are particularly vulnerable to climate crisis. They're in as big of a mess as any non-human community right now. Our vehicles in much of the world are the greatest threat to their survival. And I learned that only half of the common toads survive when they try to get to the other side of the road, which every spring and every autumn they have to migrate because they have to get to their breeding areas or their wintering areas. They've got to do this every year, twice a year, and only half survive. And a busy road, and we're not talking that busy, a car a minute, right? More than 90% of the common toads are run over by a car. So I didn't hit any deer when I was driving, but I wonder how many of these beings I killed with my car. it turns out that roads near wetlands are terribly significant when it comes to the death of frogs. And what to make matters worse, more people are driving every year. And of course, with EVs, a lot of people think, well, EVs, you know, again, it's the humane myth. The EVs will be fine. We won't be contributing to climate crisis if we get an electric vehicle. Is that really true? And here's the parallel with animal agribusiness. Like animal agribusiness, road making drains and it pollutes the waters and the wetland habitats all over the world. It's very much a parallel, right? Animal ag does this, ruins the water and the wetland habitats, as Hope talked about, the chicken litter, right? And so do cars. And speaking of habitat ruin, we've all noticed the wildfires this year. A piece in The Guardian from last year said that by 2030, we're going to see can you imagine a 14% increase in these wildfires? And that by 2030, we're going to see a 30% increase. And this is from a UN report involving more than 50 international researchers. You know, what they don't mention, but it's very obvious in this picture, is that it's not just human lives that are being taken. It's also massive biocommunities that will never be replaced as they were. And indeed, obviously, not only will they never be replaced, but this is getting worse. And it's just, what can we do to live in better harmony with our biocommunities? What can we do? This shows you how serious this is. When you look on the right bar is 2023. And this is their history. And this is a chart from Canada, from the official Canadian Bureau, the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center. And they're talking about, across the years that they've kept track of this, how much area is burned every year in Canada. Look at 2023 and tell me we are not in runaway climate crisis. Also in Canada, at the University of Ottawa, they're looking at a number of species, particularly bumblebees. And most people in this group, self-selected audience, but of course, Project Animal Freedom will be distributing this worldwide. So a lot of people don't know that bumblebees are the native bees to North America. When you see honey, you are seeing a trafficked species. Honeybees are in competition with North American bees. So people say that beekeeping is somehow saving the earth or saving species. Really, no, it's actually having a detrimental effect. The University of Ottawa is doing research on the bees, and they're showing, this is very important to the idea of the right of other animals to evolve on their own terms. Global heating affects extinction risk and related chances of colonizing a new area, right? So they can thrive somewhere else if they need to move, and changing species richness, which of course is really the definition of evolving, right? Well, if climate crisis keeps bees from doing all this, we're talking about a full frontal assault to their evolution. So not only are they disappearing, but they lose their chance to evolve as they should be on their own terms. I want to take you back bottom right here. And you can find, there's the URL, and you can find Veganism Defined from 1951. So the Vegan Society was, founded in 1944. So here it is. They're laying out their original mission statement in the long form definition of what they were doing. And it's published, and you can still see it on the IVU website, so make sure to grab it. veganism defined. And I want to read you two key phrases from this definition, from this mission statement. And think about them and our role as vegan advocates and how we show up in the world. In a vegan world, the creatures would be reintegrated within the balance and sanity of nature. Second phrase, a great and historic wrong whose effect in a vegan world, a great and historic wrong whose effect upon the course of evolution must have been stupendous, would be righted. How do I live more like that? And I said, my everyday driving a car is action. Right? It's action that bolsters Shell, British Petroleum, ExxonMobil. Let me face myself. Let me face my own hesitance to give up my car. And I turned to veganism to show me how. Meg Kelly, when we had a dress rehearsal, Project Animal Freedom is so well organized that we have dress rehearsals to this. And Meg Kelly was saying, well, I can tell you how to do that. I just never got a license. I go, oh, I'm really behind here. Because I've been driving for quite a few years, but how do I face myself and deal with this? Because I live in a car-dependent suburb. What am I supposed to do? And I thought back to when I was tempted to buy some cheese. I'm going to admit this, I was already a 10-year vegan. My mother passed away. I was out of my, I don't mean to sound ableist, use ableist language here, but this is how I feel. I was out of my mind. I couldn't think straight. My head was not screwed on. I was grieving and I was distraught beside myself. I can't explain it any better. And I was seeing this cheese that my mother used to get and used to make things, certain things, you know, when I was a little kid. And so I was repeating this, and a vegan person that I knew was hearing me say this and said, look, go back to that grocery store. You go into that aisle. Thank goodness for this. This was some straight talk. You go into that aisle, you stand there and you say to yourself, right in the grocery aisle, preferably aloud, you look at the cheese and now think about that cow that cheese came from, and think about that calf being dragged away from that cow and how these beings felt. Picture them and then say in the aisle, I'm not, you know, you get the picture, right? F you, calf, say it. I want. Thank you. Okay. I didn't pick up the cheese. And so now I'm saying, it occurs to me, I'm putting the fuel in the back of my car. There's my hand on the fuel pump. And I'm saying, can I do this? Like, isn't this like saying, F you, Emperor Penguin Chick? Isn't it? And I said, veganism is telling me how to rewild myself, how to give it up. And all those beings who are hit every year, every day, including today. I never hit somebody this big, but the roads were there for me. So I was involved, I was implicated. And so just as when I became a vegan 40 years ago, I could say to the animal world, I'm at peace with you. And so I'm at peace with myself. I can say this to this being, and I'm out there and I see that truck coming from a quarter mile. I hear that truck, and I see that family of deer crossing, and I know I'm going to put myself in the road, and I have saved them. And the truck doesn't know, why is this person trying to slow me down? But they get it when they see that around the corner what they would have done. And then I get this. And I realize that as a pedestrian, as a committed pedestrian, as an activist pedestrian, I'm saying to others, slow down. We are here. My body is a message. Have some respect. And I'd like to finish up with a thank you note. I'd like to thank, of course, Project Animal Freedom for the Vegan Climate Summit of 2023 and for making it free for everybody. It's available. Many of you have donated, and thank you for that. Making this free to people all over the world. But of course, to do a presentation and to do a summit isn't free. It takes a lot of work and many hours. And therefore, I want to specifically thank the people who, the contributors, who, for my recent birthday celebration on Facebook, who contributed to a fundraiser that I did for Project Animal Freedom, which directly helps this happen. And also to my patrons at the Studio for the Art of Animal Liberation at patreon.com/Lee Hall. So I'd like to just offer my last minute to honor and thank the people on this list. And if you happen to be here and I missed you, please write a note in the chat. And then when I put this out on my studio, I'll make sure that I don't miss you. But I think I've caught just about everyone. And I just want to say thank you, and thank you everyone here for participating in this very important event as we approach, as we are in the midst of, in the throes of, the most important time we could possibly live in human history. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, very much for your moving speech. I feel that people were very happy to hear from you, and I want to read some of the positive comments that you got. Somebody wrote, "Thank you, Lee, for a most thought-provoking presentation with critically free-ranging, important information." Another person wrote, "Thank you, Lee, for your heartfelt, authentic, and inspiring presentation." And yet another person wrote, "Oh, you're getting so many thanks. You might be getting the most thanks of anyone. Thank you, Lee, profound information and sharing. I really appreciate you. Thank you, time for me to inspect my actions too. Outstanding talk, Lee. You are able to draw us all into your serious questions about our planet, our animals, and us as humans. We must step up on so many levels. Thanks for being you." And
Yeah.
let's see, thank you, Lee. So informative. I so appreciate. Thankfully, that's something else. Thank you, Lee, so much, Lee. Bravo. Thank you so much, Lee. You're
Oh,
just
and
getting so much
Meg
love.
Kelly, thanks to Meg Kelly for all these animals who were spared all these years. I got to shout out to somebody who didn't ever get a license. Yeah.
Absolutely. And somebody is saying, well, maybe I can phrase this as a question. I want you to get one question. You just can't have a giant blanket of praise. You have to have a tough question. Do you think your reflections on whether using a car is vegan can be applied to other issues, like whether palm oil is vegan?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. I think thank you for bringing up palm oil. There's a social media account called Palm Oil Detectives. Look for that. They're doing really great work on this. Whenever we are challenged, chocolate, right? Fair trade chocolate and tea and coffee, right? The idea of going as organic as we can possibly go, as Meg is going to talk more about. All these challenges to us, how can we become better members of the bio community? Let's do the best we can from where we are. The vegan definition is to go as far as possible and practicable, which some will say, well, that kind of gives us an out, right? Because if it's as far as possible, then, no, it doesn't. As far as possible and practicable means we strive to be the very best humanity we can be. That's what veganism asks us to do. So thank you for that palm oil question. And yes, in general, it's hard, it's expensive to get vegan organic products or fair trade chocolate. This is not easy, and I'm not saying that I've got my act together. Plus, it takes money that we all don't have, but we do our best. For example, if we need to, as I do now, look at chocolate as a gift and go and look at the fair trade chocolate from Lagusta's Luscious, a vegan company, and look at Lagusta's website to see what fair trade really means. All right, if I have to save chocolate for just a special occasion and just for friends, gifts that I'll only do maybe a couple of times a year, you know what, I'm going to do it, because I don't want to enjoy the product of enslaved children. I will not. So yeah, I don't have my total act together, but I am trying, and I'm so glad that others here say, yes, I want to do the best I can with where I am standing right now. And coconuts, somebody puts in the chats, coconuts, using monkeys to climb up trees. I know. We need to press the companies that are doing the coconuts and coconut anything and write to them and find out if they are aware of the monkey coconut situation and if they are responding. Thank you.
Absolutely. I love that last part about what you said, doing the best we can at the place we are. And Stacy Anderson summarized it similarly as writing, thank you, Lee. That is exactly the point. Oh no, lots of comments. Must scroll back up. You're getting too much love, Lee.
I gotta say, with the too much love, everybody here is part of each other's contribution. It is a collective thank you. We did a dress rehearsal, and we vowed during the dress rehearsal that we are going to do a lot of cross-pollination. All right, so we are all giving all of these together. We're all presenting together. We prepared together, and we're going to go on together. Thanks, Kyle, for making that happen.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Lee. We will now transition to Megan Kelly of Learn Veganic. Chance will introduce you, but I want to give you a heads up, Meg, that you may have 7 extra minutes because we are running a bit behind schedule.
All right.
Ahead of schedule, or I get an extra few minutes?
We're running behind schedule. Did I say ahead of schedule? I meant behind schedule. Yeah. And I don't want you to get like 23 minutes. I want you to get a full 30. So you're getting
okay, so I get the full 30 as usual. Yes. Okay, that's wonderful.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Let me just get my screen shared here. Is everything looking good there, Kyle?
It's looking excellent. Very pretty
Wonderful.
Photo and font.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you for having me here, and I'm really happy to be participating in this event today. And we're going to be talking about how we can create fully plant-based food systems. So we'll explore how we can grow food veganically using entirely plant-based fertilizers without any connection back to animal agriculture. So just to introduce myself, my name is Meg Kelly, and I think I actually might have just taken Chance was supposed to introduce me, but I might have just jumped into my talk, so I'll introduce myself here. My name's Meg Kelly, and I co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network back in 2008, and that's a network where we promote veganic farming and gardening primarily in North America, but also around the world. I also teach the Learn Veganic online gardening course, which you can learn more about at learnveganic.com. And we teach people how they can grow their own fruits and vegetables at home using entirely vegan techniques. And I'm also organizing right now a veganic summit, which is our inaugural veganic summit, where we're going to have plant-based farmers and gardeners, who are experts at using veganic techniques to come and tell you more about how they have been growing and some of the techniques that you can use yourself. So as we know, animal agriculture has major ethical and environmental impacts. Over 100 billion farmed animals are killed globally each year. And beyond the obvious ethical implications of that, as we've seen, that also is associated with very inefficient land use. The amount of land that is used for animal agriculture is, leading to losses of wild areas and losses of wildlife and species extinction. There are huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases. Animal agriculture is contributing to desertification, and it also uses excessive amounts of water and leads to water pollution. So we need to collectively transition away from animal agriculture toward fully plant-based food systems. But this involves more than switching what's on our plates. We also need to change how we grow our vegetables. And not only our vegetables, but also our fruits, legumes, grains, nuts, and other plant foods. Because plant foods are typically fertilized with animal products or synthetic fertilizers. So if you're buying conventional food, it's typically fertilized either with just synthetics or a combination of synthetic fertilizers and animal byproducts. And if you're buying organic food, more often than not, it's fertilized with animal byproducts. So synthetic fertilizers are associated with a lot of fossil fuel use. So this is like a nitrogen factory right here. Nitrogen is all around us in the air. But most plants aren't able to use it directly. So in nitrogen factories, they basically use a lot of heat and a lot of pressure to take the nitrogen from the air and to make it into the form of a fertilizer. But it really does account for a significant amount of the energy use that's associated with conventional food production. And synthetic fertilizers, they can also wash away into waterways, as somebody was mentioning before. When there's too much, fertilizer or runoff going into waterways, it can cause eutrophication and really lead to the disruption or deaths of aquatic communities. And also some of the synthetic fertilizers will volatilize into the air and in the form of greenhouse gases. So what is used frequently also, both in conventional agriculture and organic agriculture, is animal-based fertilizers. These can come from slaughterhouses, so it's things like blood meal, bone meal, feather meal. And if you go into a garden center, you will see boxes of blood meal and boxes of bone meal. This is very prevalent. Animal-based fertilizers also come directly from farms where animals are farmed, like the chicken manure, sheep manure. So all of this manure that's piling up gets sold as fertilizers to grow fruits and veggies. And then there's kind of byproducts of the fishing industry or from fish farming, such as fish meal, crab meal, shrimp meal, and so on. So these are very, very common fertilizers. So animal-based fertilizers also pollute waterways through the runoff, which can again lead to eutrophication and the disruption of aquatic communities. But it can also bring things like E. coli, and salmonella to waterways or even to the fruits and veggies we eat. They can become contaminated with some of these pathogens. And there's also air pollution associated with animal-based fertilizers like manure. When we smell manure, the smell is unpleasant, but we're also breathing in certain compounds that really shouldn't be in our bodies. So it's very problematic. And, as we've seen, animal agriculture in and of itself has so many environmental problems related with just the life cycle of animal agriculture, from greenhouse gas emissions to excessive land use, excessive water use. And when we have animal-based fertilizers, well, that means that the fertilizers we're using are basically linked back to those problems. So animal-based fertilizers are a source of funding for animal agriculture, much like the leather industry is a source of funding for animal agriculture. Well, these animal-based fertilizers that are sold helps fund animal agriculture. And essentially the production of the plant foods that we eat become bound up in the ethical and environmental problems of animal ag. Another issue is that the prevalence of animal-based fertilizers that are used all over on farms leads to a false perception that animals are necessary to produce fruits and veggies. And so, much in the same way that people can be skeptical about a vegan diet, and they might say, well, where are you going to get your protein? Where are you going to get your calcium? Well, we have those same types of false perceptions in the farming sector, where people think, well, if I don't use manure, or if I don't use blood meal, where will I get my nitrogen? Where will I get my phosphorus? Where will I get my potassium? And so there's those same types of false perceptions. And that's especially prevalent in organic farming, because organic farms tend to rely even more heavily on animal-based fertilizers, because they don't use synthetic fertilizers. And so they tend quite often to default toward animal-based fertilizers. So one thing to remember is animals don't produce nutrients, and we know this when it comes to what we eat. We know that we can get our calcium directly from plants, we can get our protein directly from plants, because that's exactly where animals got them. And the same is true when it comes to fertilizer. Animals don't produce nutrients. They consume nutrients, like the nutrients that they might eat in hay, for example, and then they'll poo some of those nutrients out. So for example, if a cow eats some hay and poos out some poo, well, that poo is basically just hay that got digested a bit. It even has less in it than it had to begin with. The hay is the original, whole food source, and the original source of those nutrients. So the way things are done in our, typical agriculture that's practiced for growing plant foods is it starts with plants like hay, or like nitrogen fixing plants like alfalfa or clover, or byproducts of the food industry like soybean meal. And those are fed to farmed animals. And then as kind of a secondary byproduct of animal farming, there are things like manure and bones and feathers. And those are kind of, ground up in the case of bones or feathers, and they're used to grow plants. And so this is the way a lot of our plant foods are currently grown. Veganic is essentially the idea that we just take out everything in the middle with animal production, and we just fertilize our plants with plants. So it's very, very similar to how with a vegan diet, well, instead of eating animals, well, we just eat plants directly. So with veganic, instead of fertilizing with animals, we fertilize with plants directly. And I do want to mention that veganic farms are not free from animals, but rather veganic farms are a place where all the animals are free. So on veganic farms, there certainly are animals around. It's just that instead of being, chickens that have been, genetically, manipulated over the years through selective breeding, that come from another continent and so forth. Well, instead, in my veganic gardens and in other people's veganic farms, there's going to be blue jays, and there's going to be hawks, and there's going to be chickadees, and there's going to be a wide variety of free living birds that live naturally in the area. And when it comes to this question of, well, how do we go from something like hay or alfalfa or soybean to something that can actually feed a plant? Well, that's a situation where we really encourage the natural soil life, including bacteria and fungi and worms, to thrive. And by basically feeding the soil with vegetable-based organic matter, the microbial community will come back on its own, and they'll actually break down the plant matter, and then the nutrients will be released for the next generation of plants. So we can't go into all the details about all the ways that we could grow using veganic techniques, but just to say there's a lot of them. It can be things like grass clippings. It can be the tree branches that are cut down in your neighborhood that are chipped up. It can be hay, it can be growing plants in the form of living mulch or green manure, which are plants that we grow in order to feed the soil. So, you know, there's a ton of different ways we can grow veganically. And I would encourage you to go onto one of our websites, learnveganic.com/materials, and you can get a free 8-page guide to 20 veganic materials where you can start to learn more about the ways that we can fertilize without animal products. So some of the main principles of veganic growing is that we have no animal-based fertilizers at all. We don't use any chemical inputs, so no chemical fertilizers, and no pesticides and no herbicides. So as you might have noticed, the word veganic kind of looks like a combo of vegan and organic. It was actually originally coined as vegetable organic, but has since then kind of evolved to vegan organic, but either way, it means the same thing. And so basically what we're doing with veganic is we're combining the principles of veganism and the principles of organic agriculture. We're taking everything that's good about organic and then we're veganizing it and not associating it with animal ag. Also with veganic, we go beyond that. With veganic, we ideally grow our own plant-based fertilizers directly on site, directly in our garden or on our farm, or we can make our own plant-based fertilizers instead of relying on fertilizers that are kind of shipped in from afar. And with veganic, we also encourage soil life, we provide habitat for wildlife, and we help bring back biodiversity. So we really try to have integrated farms that are very, very vibrant. So I'm going to show you very quickly a few veganic farms around the world. And I know we have Kenneth joining us here in the chat from Kenya. So I'd also like to point out that we do have a veganic farmer with us here today. So please feel free to say hello to Kenneth in the chat. I know he's looking for volunteers right now, even international volunteers that can help him with his mission of promoting veganics in Kenya. But I'll show you a few from North America and from England here. First of all, I'd just like to say that there are a couple of farm maps. You can go and look on goveganic.net to see an interactive farm map of farms in North America. This definitely doesn't show all of the veganic farms. So if you don't find one in your area, you might have to dig a bit deeper through other means, but this is a good place to start. There's also a farm map for the UK and Europe on veganicfarming.org, where again, you can look up farms and see if there is one in your area. One farm that I really like is La Ferme de l'Aube, that's in Canada, not too far from where I am. And the farmers Jimmy Videlli and Melanie Bernier have been farming veganically for years after transitioning from originally farming with animals. Jimmy had a farm back in Arizona where he had animals on the farm and he thought that they were necessary. And he went through a period of skepticism to realize that, okay, actually he can farm veganically and he can make it work. They also have a small seed business there too. And Jimmy recently wrote the Veganic Grower's Handbook, Cultivating Fruits, Vegetables, and Herbs from Urban Backyard to Rural Farmyard, where he talks about his transition from non-veganic agriculture to veganic and the techniques that he's using today that you can use too. And Jimmy recently launched the North American certification program, Certified Veganic, which you can learn more about at certifiedveganic.org. Helen Athow is an awesome veganic farmer down in the United States. She has farmed in a few different states now. And she's really developed some wonderful techniques for growing plant-based fertilizer right in the field. So here we can see this is her actual crop, what she's actually growing to be eaten and sold. And this is her fertilizer. So we have fertilizer, crop, fertilizer, crop. And basically this is nitrogen fixing legume plants like clover that she's going to mow down and then feed. She's going to take the clippings from this in order to fertilize here. So it can be a lot more self-sufficient because you can grow your own fertilizers directly. She also grows her own plant-based fertilizers in orchards in order to fertilize fruit trees. So again, around her plants, she has a lot of nitrogen-fixing plants like clover that are growing that she can use to fertilize her fruit trees. And she recently wrote a book called The Ecological Farm, which is really getting the idea of veganic agriculture out to a very non-vegan audience. And Tolhurst Organic is in England, and Ian Tolhurst has been farming veganically using plant-based techniques for more than 3 decades now. He's really the pioneer in the field. He grows his plant-based fertilizers right in his fields, and he sells locally within a very small radius from his farm. And there was a really in-depth carbon footprint analysis done on his farm a few years ago, and it showed that Tolhurst Organic Farm is 90% more efficient than supermarket produce. If anyone has a multi-acre farm and they want to learn his techniques, he wrote a book about 17 years ago called Growing Green that details all of his techniques. In England, there's the stock-free organic certification. Stock-free is another word that is essentially synonymous with veganic. Stock-free organic farms in England are kind of the equivalent of veganic farms in North America. So you can learn more about their certification program. And I'd also like to give a shout out for the Biocyclic Vegan Standard, which is essentially synonymous with veganic or stock-free or vegan organic. So there are lots of different words you can look up online if you're trying to learn more about these farming techniques. And they have a certification program at biocyclic-vegan.org. So now we're going to look at how you can grow your own veganic garden, because I know not all of us are going to have a farm near us and not all of us are going to become farmers. So I am a big fan of everybody starting to grow a little bit of their own food or a lot of their own food, whatever's realistic for you. So I've personally been gardening veganically for 15 years without ever owning a home. So if you think you can't garden unless you own a home, I have spent the last 15 years gardening as a renter or in community gardens or at other people's homes, so it can be done. Here's one of my gardens, veganic garden at a community garden, which I fertilized primarily with my own homemade compost. This is one of our gardens on a balcony. This one was also fertilized with homemade compost and also some alfalfa pellets. This is a veganic garden that we've been growing in the countryside where one of my friends grew up on a farm. And this one's actually fertilized with hay. So we just put a bunch of hay on the ground about 12 inches thick, and then we'll just plant a bunch of, tomato plants and squash plants through the hay. And again, as I mentioned, hay and manure are essentially equivalents. So we have a garden that's like entirely fertilized with hay. This is a new garden I've had for the last 2 summers. It's in a neighbor's yard. One of my neighbors had a garden that was too big for her, so I started gardening on half of her garden. We can find options even if we don't have that much access to land ourselves. And there's all sorts of potential to garden veganically in community projects. This is a veganic community garden that I put in at a housing center for young moms and their kids. So there are so many options. There are so many areas that we can green the space. So I would just say to look around, see what spaces are available for you, and whether it's even a couple of pots on your balcony or your front porch, or whether it's getting involved in a big community project or turning your whole lawn into a thriving garden, I would just suggest getting started. And I think we need to prioritize growing food and growing fertilizer instead of just growing grass lawns. The grass lawn has become so common that in a lot of neighborhoods you might even get in trouble if you don't have a grass lawn. It's a bizarre aesthetic that our culture has has taken on, but we need to start challenging that and start growing more food and more fertilizer in the spaces we have available. So one option, if someone wanted to have a lawn but didn't just want it to be grass, you want it to actually be more useful for gardening, you can grow your own clover lawn with things like short clovers, like Dutch white clover, for example. So clover is a legume plant. So, beans are legumes, chickpeas are legumes, peas are legumes. Well, clover is also a legume. And legumes have this amazing ability to access nitrogen from the air. So basically in a legume plant, they have like some special bacteria living in their roots, and those bacteria can get nitrogen from the air and share it with the legume plant. This is how the nitrogen cycle works out in natural environments, out in fields and, prairies and forests. There will be nitrogen fixing plants around. So you can actually turn your like whole front lawn into a nitrogen fixing front lawn if you want. And it's basically like having your own nitrogen producing factory at home that's totally ecological. And then if you're gardening, you can actually let the clover go to flower so that the pollinators can enjoy it. And shortly after it's done flowering, or around the time that it's flowering, you can chop it down and you can use those clover clippings to fertilize your garden. So you could compost the clover clippings, you could mix them in with your soil, you could put them on your soil as a mulch. There's so many options, but this is a way you can grow your own fertilizer quite easily. You can also just straight up convert your lawn or someone else's lawn into a fruit and veggie garden. So this is one person who had just joined us for our Learn Veganic course, who turned her front lawn in Los Angeles into a lovely garden. And she's been getting all of these, she's got all these great harvests from it. And, before it was just grass. So you can go from grass to harvests. So just to talk about a couple of the things that we can do in terms of fertilization beyond clover lawns, we can also make compost. And I'd recommend making compost regardless of whether you're planning to garden or not. If you decide to garden later, you'll be happy to have finished compost. But also, you can give compost to your gardener friends. But above anything else, composting is one of the ways that we can have a really positive environmental impact. Because right now, so many plant-based nutrients are trashed. Okay, we've got food scraps and grass and leaves that often end up in dumps, basically. And when this stuff ends up in a dump, and it gets covered in other things, it goes through an anaerobic digestion process and it creates methane. So, methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas, and if you're sending your food scraps to the dump, that's what's going on. So when you do composting at home, you're doing an aerobic process with oxygen, and it'll turn into soil instead of creating a bunch of methane. Making compost, there's tons of ways to do it. I'm going to show you one way that's super simple. You take 1 part kitchen scraps or grass clippings, 2 parts leaves, and you mix them together. So I could have 1 handful of grass clippings, 2 handfuls of leaves, 1 bucket of kitchen scraps, 2 buckets of leaves. Mix them together. Should be slightly moist, not dripping, not dry. Gonna aerate it occasionally with like a pitchfork or a stick. And in a few months, it's going to start breaking down and looking more and more like dirt. And when it looks like dirt, it's ready to go into the garden. So here's some of our lovely veganic compost. You can compost just in a pile. I prefer to compost in a bin because I can compost all winter, even if it gets snowed on. It keeps things a bit nicer and neater for me too in my backyard. And if you're in an area where you don't have much space, you're renting, you might move, so on, you can actually have a tumbler composter. And that's one that's just on little legs. And if you're in an area, especially where there might be cohabitation issues with rats or with mice, this can be a good way to keep your compost, a little bit set apart so that that doesn't become an issue. And this is a balcony compost here. So this is a way that you can garden on your balcony in a garden pot. So we just throw our compost in the middle, and this is what it looks like when there's another pot on top. And so it can be a really lovely part of a balcony garden where you can compost small amounts of food scraps. So you can look for plant-based resources in your neighborhood, either to compost or to use as mulch. It can be things like fall leaves, dandelions are super nutrient rich, things like nettles that are really high in nutrients, clover that we can grow, wood chips from arborists. So there are so many options for plant-based resources to use instead of using chemical fertilizers or animal products. And we also want to create habitat as we're creating our gardens. We have put concrete everywhere. We've put asphalt everywhere. We've covered over natural rivers and streams. We've got rid of most of the native flora. And native fauna, wildlife, they don't have a lot to live off of in our city environments. So there's little things that we can do to help them out. This is one person again who joined us for our online gardening course, where this was his first year gardening, and here it is at the beginning of the year that we can see this little pond that he's put in and some bug hotels. This is a bit later in the season with the pond here. And again, it just gives animals a place to drink. And if just to say, you know, even from the perspective, I think we should share a lot of our harvests with animals. You know, if animals come and nibble on our food, well, that's fine. I grow a bunch of food to improve biodiversity in my area. I grow a bunch of plants. I get to eat a bunch, some animals to get to eat some stuff. That's all wonderful. But I just want to mention, sometimes animals eat tomatoes and cucumbers because they're thirsty and there aren't any water sources around. So if we start by putting in some water sources, we can make sure that they have enough to drink, and maybe you'll end up with more cucumbers at the same time. So also putting in fruit bushes and fruit trees. This is a gooseberry patch that we have. This is not a very big bush. It's maybe like 2 feet by 2 feet or 3 feet by 3 feet, but just having even a smallish bush has led to a whole bunch of birds creating nests in our garden. And you can keep this really simple. If you don't have a lot of space, you can make it simple. Just putting in a drinking fountain. Here we've got just some water, a dish of water with some little pieces of wood floating, and there's all sorts of pollinators who will come here and drink. So we put the floating wood in so that they have a little landing pad so that, you know, butterflies and bumblebees and other pollinators can use this as a drinking fountain. Having flowers is so important. Having things that flower early and mid-season and late season. It's so important to help native pollinators make it through the year. And just putting in hiding spots for critters. You know, you can get creative with it, but by putting in hiding spots, you're getting, you know, more biodiversity welcomed into your garden. So if you're interested in learning more about veganics, and I hope you are, there's a few resources here. As I mentioned before, there's the Veganic Agriculture Network, and this is where you can find out more about some veganic farms on the map, and more about veganic farming and gardening techniques and books that are available. We teach a Learn Veganic Gardening course. I absolutely love teaching this course because it brings together people from around the world, some people who are totally new to gardening, some people who are really experienced gardeners, but we all have the same mindset around gardening in a way that is animal friendly. So you can check that out at learnveganic.com. And we're really excited too to be offering our first ever Veganic Summit. It's happening online from November 10th to 12th. I'd encourage you to go register. You can register for free at veganicsummit.com. And we'll have a bunch of experts on veganic farming and gardening, including the 3 farmers that I showed earlier. They'll all be joining us to give talks. So yeah, thank you very much for having me here. And I really enjoyed taking part in the summit and hearing all the speakers. And I'll be here until the end of the event today. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions about veganics in the chat.
Thank you so very much, Meg, for sharing all this valuable information with us. People often don't realize how crucial it is that we move away from conventional agriculture altogether, not just animal agriculture, but all conventional agriculture toward veganic agriculture. So thank you so much for your insight. Your presentation did generate a number of questions. The first I will answer, namely, how can you watch this summit at a later time? Within the next week, will be uploading a video to YouTube and sharing it on Facebook until Facebook tells me to stop sharing it, because Facebook doesn't like non-Facebook links. But anyway, you will be able to watch it within the next week. I have a lot of people asking me for the recording, so it will get done. And then the next question is for you, Meg. What about hydroponics and aeroponic to grow indoors?
Yeah, so you can certainly do, you know, you can certainly do plant-based gardening or farming indoors. What we primarily talk about and what we primarily promote is ways that you can grow outdoors in a way that you're creating habitat and, you know, in in conjunction with nature, but I understand that some people just have indoor spaces and that's what you have available. So there are certain veganic products on the market. If you just kind of went on a search engine and typed in veganic and hydroponic, you will find some plant-based fertilizers that are available.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meg. And we're running behind schedule, but given how many questions there were, I want to give you at least one more. Give me just a moment. Another person asked about hydroponics. Do you have anything else you would like to add, or do you feel your current answer is sufficient?
I think it's sufficient because I don't have a lot of experience with it either, so I can't necessarily go into more detail.
Absolutely. 1 second. There's somebody who mentions that they feel guilt about harming bugs and worms and other life whenever they disturb their compost pile. Do you have anything you can say to assuage our conscience when we're accidentally chopping worms in two?
Okay, so one thing that you can do is you can add in some more airy, bulky materials where you wouldn't necessarily have to turn your compost. So if, for example, in your compost bin, if everything becomes kind of squishy and there's not much air in there, yeah, you do have to get in and add some air. Otherwise, it's going to go anaerobic and there's going to be methane and so on and so forth. But if some of your compost materials are kind of dry autumn leaves, or you add some straw, or you add some hay, or you add a bunch of little sticks, that can create a bunch of passive aeration. So if you have a bunch of passive aeration, you don't necessarily need to turn it. Or we looked at the tumbler composter. If you had a tumbler composter, you can just kind of spin a handle to turn it. I'm not saying the worms are going to be thrilled, but they might like it better than a pitchfork.
Thank you very much, Meg. And I will double down and say you need to go to the Veganic Summit. Could you remind me when it is? I've already forgotten.
Yeah, November 10th to 12th, Veganic Summit, and I would love to see all of you there.
Wow, if it's going from the 10th to 12th, you're going to learn even more there than you will here today.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're going to have more than 10 speakers all about veganics.
Absolutely. That's a very impressive feat. So thank you, Meg. We will now transition over to Connie Spence with the Agriculture Fairness Alliance. Connie is a 13-year vegan food system educator and recently a renowned DC federal lobbyist. In a pioneering move, she established the Agriculture Fairness Alliance in 2019, marking it as one of the USA's first vegan-backed federal lobbying groups. She is inspired to teach all communities the truth about the food system and hopes to empower people to follow in her policy-making footsteps. She hopes to ignite collective action to reshape our food system into one that embodies fairness, our ethics, and puts our environment back on the right track. She will deliver an invigorating speech titled From Plate to Policy, Vegan Spearheading Urgent Food System Overhauls for the Climate, revealing what we can do as ordinary citizens to drive policy toward food and climate justice. You will leave Connie's presentation both feeling empowered and knowing how to get involved in this growing movement. As countless studies attest, the current trajectory of our food system has direct implications for climate change, and immediate action to change food policy is required. It's a misconception that only seasoned experts can influence these policies. Every individual, regardless of experience, can and must play a role. To combat climate change, we urgently need to scrutinize, revise, and innovate our food policies. By proactively engaging in policy discussions, forming strategic alliances, and pressing our representatives, we can redirect our food systems towards sustainability. The stakes are high, and the time to act is now. Please welcome Connie Spence.
Hey, everybody. Can you see and hear me? I thank you so much for having me on today. And I want to give you a little bit of excitement because I think that, before I go into my presentation, we are in a situation where we hear these words like crisis and we hear about how urgent things need to be done. And sometimes it can feel so overwhelming. And I want you to hear my story, not only of kind of the whole policy like purview, but also my story is something that is relatable. You know, I'm going to go through like me being a DC lobbyist, for example, is not something I ever thought I would do. It's not something that I have any experience doing, but what I was is I was a passionate street activist, and I knew that I had to get involved. And I thought I would do it from my home with lobbyists in DC. And sure enough, this year I moved to DC, uprooted my entire life. And there are so many things that I've learned here being on the ground that we as a movement really need to get behind, and we don't need to be scared about it. I am not a DC lobbyist person, like meaning I don't fit the part, but the reality is we need to change what that looks like. So I'm going to get into my presentation, and bear with me because there's context to, you know, policy and relation to climate change. Towards the end, I'll talk about my experience in DC and how you can do the same. All right. Now let me go to my presentation and share my screen here in a second. Hold on. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we already went into sort of the overview of the conversation and blah, blah, blah. This is the about me stuff. I've been vegan for 13 years and I would say a pretty seasoned street activist, not just for veganism, but for many social issues related to LGBTQ issues, women's issues, racism stuff and beyond. And one of the key points I'd like to make in this section is that I want to leave this specific statement with you. I believe that politicians look the way they do and act the way they do because they're a mirror of the lobbyists that meet with them in their offices and hold them accountable. And until we change what lobbyists show up, because right now the lobbyists that show up are corporations, lobbyists, or the CEOs themselves. And we know what the Fortune 1000 CEOs all look like and all act like, right? Very capitalistic, very, you know, white male majority. That's the mirror, right? And so when we start showing up as lobbyists and we start taking up these spaces, I believe that politicians will start looking like a much more diverse group of people. Okay, so I just want to leave that in your mind. So moving on, really, like, policy is so related to veganism and to climate change, and we really need to understand the current food system. A lot of people don't. It's very much about our personal actions. It's about how to change others. And I think that we need to continue obviously doing that, but we need to step up our game and understand systemically, what is this system composed of and why is it the way it is? Why are we on this super speed of like a collision course of catastrophe? Well, the truth is the food system was designed to be rigged from the beginning. The founding fathers were agrarianists. I'm going to explain what that means in a second. They basically felt that the first people that arrived here, many were farmers, and that they should be able to own the land and control the food system and be valued by society as literally an oligarchy. Why did they view that? Well, they came from Europe, where they were farmers and peasants were at the bottom and the oligarchy was at the top. And so they flipped that. They were literally called agrarianists. And if you, like I said, if you don't know what that means, I'm going to get to it in a second. The Constitution was designed to keep them in power. They wrote it that way. They wrote it in a way where no matter how few farmers were there, no matter if they're the minority, that they would stay in power. A great example of this that everybody knows is Senate representation. Literally, as Los Angeles has 10 million people in a state that has 40 million people, and you get 2 senators in the same way that a state has 600,000 people. That is, while it's designed to sound like it keeps those minority areas, to have similar say, what it's done is it's made rural farming areas really control a lot of the US funding and decision-making and policy. So what is agrarianism? It basically is a social and political philosophy that puts value on farmers, and it emphasizes that these people basically need to stay in power, not only of land, but also political decisions. And it sets them like as almost like I said, like a oligarchy at the top. Now, I'm going to sort of play this back. I know no one can really answer, but did you know this? Did you know that literally the foundation of the Constitution was based on agrarianism? Like, I didn't know this until I sort of studied it. And then when you start seeing all of the things that happen today, where we're like I said, we're on this like fast track to disaster, it's because it was designed to keep those people in power, and those people have become globalists. And for some reason, it's not clicking over. Hold on. Okay. So moving on, I want you to understand that we are being used. Our taxes are being used. This is a huge problem. I want you to think synergistically with the concept of blood diamonds and people going to land that isn't theirs to basically extract as much as possible from it because there's a resource that they need. The United States resource that they need are taxes that subsidize and basically make their products have little to limited overhead cost and make them profit a ton, and our land. Our land is literally creating an agriculture apocalypse because all these globalists and all these global food system people want access to our land and our taxes, which create subsidies for them. And so our land is brokered to globalist food corporations. It's not even designed to feed us. And in fact, in many ways, it withholds food from us. Export-driven policies are increasing tremendously every single year. And again, I'm tying this into policy. Our government uses our taxes to fund different things. And so when it decides to increase funding to exporting, we're basically paying for these corporations to make a lot more money because our taxes are supporting their overhead cost. And so that's the whole point. It's like, it's not even designed to feed us. Set aside livestock. And I know people don't like calling these animals livestock, but in the relationship to policy, it's an umbrella term. And so I'm not trying to marginalize or whatever the individualism of the different animals, but basically we're in a situation where the reason livestock is used in this money-making scheme is because there's a gazillion inputs to livestock. So every input they can make a bunch more money off of. Whereas fruits and vegetables, there aren't a lot of inputs. There's equipment and there's water. With livestock, there's a lot more inputs. And so it allows for an exponential amount of our taxes paying for funding and then rigging the system because there's stuff like insurance policies that protect them along the way. But anyways, looking at this and our land being brokered, our exports are just continuing to grow. It was 213 billion last year, up just within 1 year from 192 billion the year before. And with that said, this graph sort of shows like what we're allowing these global food system people to do, right? If you look from 2001, we're letting them basically use and exploit our land. And you know that it's not just exploiting that, it's exploiting people, it's exploiting undocumented people that can't go up against the system. It's exploiting children. And clearly, many of us are vegan today, so we know that it's exploiting and creating huge suffering environments for animals as well. A lot of our land beyond being used for livestock is clearly, I'm sure, we've repeated this, but is used for livestock feed. So we're now in a situation where we're in an agriculture apocalypse, where we are allowing our land to be destroyed for global livestock. This is not just a vegan concept. It really isn't. Like, literally any taxpayer in the United States today should be pissed off that we are basically being used for our taxes to not even reduce our grocery costs, but essentially make these corporations so powerful. So beyond that, this is another stat, right now, soybeans, it's like 90 something percent is, there's the stat here that shows 74 million acres to 87 million acres from 2002 to 2022 is being used just for soy alone. There are stats that say 70% of soy is used for animal feed, but I don't really know if that number is accurate, because as a lobbyist, we've actually spent time with some of these soybean groups, and they'll say stuff like 95% of their acreage is for livestock. So it doesn't completely match up, but nonetheless, these are more like apocalyptic, catastrophic stats that come from our land being brokered and used, again, through policy and funding, but being brokered and used, it's creating this climate crisis. So there are 893 million farmable land acres in the USA. 87 million of that is used for soy. 70%, this is the stat that clearly goes around and you can use. I was mentioning that when we actually speak to the soy associations, that multiple of them talk about, the acreage used is like 95%. But anyway, 70% of soy is used for animal feed, both domestic and abroad. 654 million to 778 million of those acres are used to raise livestock, and then 127 million is used for livestock feed. Literally, almost all of our farmable land is used for livestock. And again, not in livestock feed, not just domestic, but exporting. So again, if you can't see with those numbers that we are being used like tremendously for our land for this, I mean, it's wild. Fruits and vegetables are only 2% of that number. Of 893 million, only 2%, which I think is 17 million or something like that, are used for fruits and vegetables to feed people directly. Continuing on, this is just sort of just reiterating that our US food system overwhelmingly has bias to our taxes being used to fund livestock and livestock feed operations. Again, going back to the agrarianism philosophy. And this destroys our land, and it creates a ripple effect of climate issues. Something that happened to me that I think is very prominent in my life is I had lived in Los Angeles and loved the weather. It was 73 degrees every single day by the beach. And I moved to DC, and this whole past year, that 1 degree or whatever that the ocean, the ocean temperature rising, Los Angeles was as humid as DC is, and DC is considered a swamp. And so I don't even know if I decide to leave DC if I have the same LA to go back to. I think that's freaking crazy, right? To think that we're literally in a situation where something like that is such a big shift, because now, while with humans it's uncomfortable to us, think of all that land used to raise these animals and the amount of suffering that they go through that has increased because of this climate change. And so anyways, policy shifts are needed to prioritize feeding our own population with healthy, locally produced fruits, vegetables, and grains rather than producing destructive crops for global markets. I know that's obvious, right? Now, where am I going to take this? I'm going to pull policy into it in a second. This isn't the first time that big ag has caused a giant climate crisis. I mean, imagine having dust bowl conditions for years on top of, Great Depression stuff that was going on at that time. The livestock, the the agriculture industry at that time was not only just as corrupt, but they were just as sloppy. They allowed this to happen. They also, when they weren't getting their way, they were killing animals on purpose, just to like overkilling them. They're gonna, okay, so granted, with the agriculture industry, to feed people, they're going to kill them anyway, but they were doing it in a flagrant way, and they were literally like throwing a tantrum. The majority of these medium sized and large farmers at this point, I mean, that's the whole point. They're so corrupt, and you know, they know that they have such control over policy and government that they do throw these tantrums. But anyways, the Dust Bowl is a great example of keeping these industries completely unchecked through policy. All right, so this is the fun stuff. Let me like do a quick time check. I know we were running late, so do I have 5 minutes or 10?
You have 15 more minutes, including.
Okay.
You have
Okay.
plenty of time. I forgot to mention that before you got started. I
Got it.
apologize for the oversight, but you've got plenty of time.
Perfect. So debunking the myths. This is the fun part, right? Like I could go into the stats of how much the catastrophe is like changing our lives. And I know many of you have all heard it before and we've seen it. We see it across the news. I don't want to do that. I want to like get into the fun stuff, the fun and like what I believe will get us on the right path. And it's an urgent fix and it's an urgent path we have to get on. We need to challenge the misconception that only seasoned experts can make a difference. And what I mean is like, I think for a long time, I just assumed that lobbyists and politicians were somebody who was, you know, in school and they majored in political science and maybe went to law school. And I just assumed that was like this path. But the truth is like, you just have to have the audacity to get into these spaces. In many cities and states, the age, you know, to run for city council is actually 18 years old, right? Or 24. But the point is like, you don't have to have this entire career that leads you up there. You can just decide, I want to get involved. And that's why you see all these politicians sometimes saying really unintelligent stuff on camera because they just have the audacity, right? Like, so why not us think about the same? You could have a complete career switch and a city like Los Angeles, their city council, I think starting is like $80,000 or something like that. I just think that more of us need to recognize that there's ways to merge our activism into becoming policy people, either policy people like the lobbyist or policy people as those who are literally sitting and sponsoring these types of legislation or funds. Anyways, it's not as hard as you think. So I wanted to keep the lobbyists here before I moved to DC, and I would basically be the strategic person under the hood. But I just felt like I didn't look the part and that we needed seasoned lobbyists that looked the part to be here. And I was totally wrong. I started visiting here and I like had an epiphany. I was absolutely wrong. You don't need the experience. You just need the passion, and the passion helps you, you know, get to the point that you need to be able to speak intelligently. And imagine how many conversations you've had with family members and friends rebutting everything. And then as you keep going, you start remembering stats and you start coming more prepared because you don't want to be left like, you know, without a good rebuttal or something that makes them think. It's the same thing. You're literally packaging those ingredients of rebuttaling, like with trolls on Facebook, in Congress. It's like the same thing. Writing legislation can be a challenge, but we have some scrappy ideas. I kid you not. We're going through Farm Bill policy right now. The Farm Bill, the foundational Farm Bill is 1,000 pages. I absolutely used AI to help me summarize those 1,000 pages and to find areas where I could add and change things. I absolutely use AI. I use AI to help edit my policy writing. I have zero career in policy writing and all of that. And I literally have turned around stuff for our other lobbyists that they've had minor changes to. And I did that in, like I said, I arrived in DC in like March. Think of like how many years that people think that they need to be able to like learn how to do this. And I've done it in ways because of my scrappiness, my passion, and my help with AI to be able to do it, right? Who can influence, create policy? I want to show you pictures of me because I kid you not, if you know or see me in person, I do not look the part of a polished lobbyist. I am like the last thing you can think of being, you know, belonging in those spaces, but this is like me. Like I'm like in these spaces. Like do I know like someone who has never met me or doesn't know my history or anything like that might be like, oh yeah, she goes, you know, into these offices and lobbies. I'm trying to show you like how different I am and this person right here, like getting in the door and having these meetings and brushing shoulders and shaking hands with all of these politicians that you see on TV, love or hate them, right? And I can't hear your reactions or anything, but I really want you to know like how wild this is in my head. But we have to do it. We have to take these risks and do things that we think like we're not capable of. And what I've learned has been just, you know, it's been really, really, it's really impressive here. So I've learned how to effectively communicate to the, you know, urgencies and benefits of vegan policies to those in power. And I try to educate people on the same. My little dog is pitter-patting behind me. If you can hear that, I apologize. And then what is it like in DC? I live in an area right next to the president's helicopters. These helicopters go by, you see the Capitol in the background, all those people that you see on TV that you, like I said, love or hate, I go into their offices. DC, besides being the swamp, is such a cool place. Like, I really think that politics in so many ways drives people nuts because it's terrible, right? It really is. And people are like, I don't want to participate in that. You know, it's terrible in a lot of ways. But I don't want to sit back and lay down and let this whole industry like completely squash us. And so by coming here, it is really cool though. There's a lot of really great aspects because in so many ways, many of you might have written letters to your House rep or your senator. You might have written, like, you can literally step into their offices and meet with them and hand them legislation and, you know, try to drive them to sponsor it or to back it. There's a lot of things that are just really incredible here. And I think that I would love for the next generation to see this as a potential career path that they can hone in on their activism skills, utilize a passion, and make a good living from it. Clearly, I'm with a nonprofit, but if you were to be hired by, you know, any of these groups as a lobbyist, that it's a very lucrative career, right? And you're mixing all of those things that are important to you. We cannot overlook food policy anymore. It is not just about individual change because policy creates accessibility. And if the only accessibility is being created for meat and dairy, then you're going to always be up against that. Or if policy is always funding more exports, your activism, like, you're not going to be 10 countries ahead of where they're trying to create that export. That's why policy is so important, right? We could veganize the entire US, but if they're brokering our land to feed somewhere else, you know, every new country that they decide to get funding for to help with exports or to build, you know, new trade policy, how do we get ahead of that in just social, you know, activism and social change? We can't. You have to get involved in policy. What the future could be in DC with many vegan lobbyists, I kid you not, like, I really believe one day vegan lobbyists, and I would love for AFA, Agriculture Fairness Alliance, which is the lobbying org that I founded. I would love to see us flood DC with vegan lobbyists. I would love for these politicians, the meat industry, to be like, what the F is this? Where did all these vegan lobbyists come from? And I would love for vegan lobbyists to represent underrepresented communities as well, right? I would love for us to be a whole person. I'm a whole person, LGBTQ, you know, women. I'm half Bolivian, half German, like, so Hispanic, and so with a, you know, immigrant mom. So the amount that you can represent as a whole person in policy, right? You start looking at policy of, this is funding, where do I want it to go? Whose economic power do I want to build? What changes do I want to make? And again, being a lobbyist is perfect for a passionate vegan street activist who's good at speaking. Under the hood, you could probably write legislation and do a bunch of other stuff like that, and even set up meetings, but you will have to feel comfortable speaking with people that, you know, have a presence. But again, how many vegan street events have you gone to where the person on the bullhorn that's giving a speech, you're just like, wow, they're freaking amazing, right? And they're speaking to a crowd of vegans. We need those people, and we need to encourage them to run for office, run for policy, local level, or even beyond that. And additionally, they would be perfect as a lobbyist. Examples of policy that can save animals and the environment that are passable. Now, this is one thing that is going to be a little bit of a tough conversation. Creating policy that's not passable is a lot of resources and energy used. You have to create stuff that's passable, and there's a lot of it. And if anybody wants to reach out to me and sort of engage and talk about this, oh, absolutely can. You can't create policy that says end livestock and agriculture and get it passed by, you know, all of Congress. I wish we could. You can't. On a local level, could you make very harsh changes? Absolutely. On a federal level, you have to create policy that's passable. So you heard people before, veganic farming, bunch of different concepts. You can get funding for that through local policy. And the beauty of it is think about funding. You're reducing the funding that goes to livestock. And so that's really important. So if there's policy to be made on every level for urban farming gardens, and it's really popular right now. There's a lot. And on either end, you could write the policy, or you can start your own, you know, company even utilizing this funding. Any land, anywhere solutions for transitioning livestock farms to plant-based farms is especially urgent for this climate crisis. I had mentioned before all that farmable land. We're in a situation where the insurance policies for how many animals that die because of climate through these farmers is through the roof. And nobody wants to talk about it. They want to just keep pumping money to see these animals suffer through these droughts and these, you know, hurricanes and these blizzards and all this swing effect of climate change. And we're in a situation where we need to start auditing when a area literally can't keep animals alive through those insurance policies. And it's a concept we've been bringing up where it's basically saying that we're wasting money. This isn't economically viable anymore. And the most conservative person should think it's nonsensical to keep throwing money at a farm that can't even feed anybody because the climate won't allow it to. And so with that said, transitioning those farms to, you know, to plant-based farms and even like using the storage shed. One of my board members has done like really great work on understanding how to transition farms. But with that concept, you're meeting all of this climate perspective that comes from politicians at this point where they do want these solutions. Expanding funding to human grade domestic crops. There's a lot of funding that says crops, but there are so many crops that you almost have to individually write them out. And if you don't, guess what crops are the ones that they're going to give funding to? Dairy, they consider dairy a crop, and soy. And so unless you call out specifically that it's fruits, vegetables, human grade grains, a lot of the funding for crops, a lot of our taxes are paying right back into livestock feed. And then anything to reduce the power funding to livestock creatively is great policy to push. Okay, so I'm going to speed along. We're finished. Anyway, so I'm in DC. I am a registered federal lobbyist. I want all of you to consider like how you can get involved in the systemic stuff. It sounded boring at first. It's totally not. The future of AFA, we want to start incubating people that want to become lobbyists. We don't, you know, that needs funding. We would need funding to be able to do that. We've pitched it a few times. I believe it's a matter of time where we'll receive funding that'll help us do that. And in that sense, we can start having internships. We can start, you know, getting people in here and creating that foundation of a bunch of vegan lobbyists running around DC and making people wake the F up. So I'm Connie. I don't know if you have any questions, but I hope you feel empowered. That's the Agriculture Fairness Alliance IG also.
Thank you so much, Connie, for that tour de force of a presentation. Many people were looking forward to this before even realizing you were a speaker. Many people were talking about how we need political solutions to the issues of animal agriculture, and you are our final speaker and finally answered some of the questions they've had all along. Here are some specific questions that have been asked recently in the chat. You did inspire quite a few questions. Oh, 1 second, let me scroll. I could swear I was just there. Somebody asked, how do you have the guts to get into Washington service, and how did you find the way to step into legislature's offices and present your case?
So if you don't know what I did before in the street, I used to be called Vegan Batgirl because I used to shine this giant stage light on walls that would say like different stats about why someone should go vegan. And that probably stepped me into this whole like risk-taking arena, because that light would cause a lot of reaction. It was 80 feet in diameter, which is like 8 stories high. I mean, it was giant, and police would come. It was just a bunch of stuff where I had to be really prepared to talk to police. That helped me. And again, street activists talk to police all the time. That helped me have the guts to like step into these stages. I also do have a career where you know, I've done sort of like software business development and data business development. So part of me does come prepared with stats and stuff like that, where I feel like it lends well to this. But that's what I was saying, like somebody who already is a good speaker at these vegan street activist events would be perfect for this, because it's a mix of feeling comfortable and also just making sure that you have all the information you need to be able to adjust to any situation. My background is in data, and this isn't something everybody needs, but having data is also a great way to hold politicians accountable. So when I go into these offices, you know, if they're to say something like, you know, well, I just don't have the funds to do it. You know, my biggest supporters are livestock farmers, and they're 70% of my district. I'll turn the question around and I'll say, oh, so what you're saying is that you don't care about your, you know, 30% that grow avocados, broccoli, and asparagus. You don't want that uplift in their vote. And they're like, oh no, I'm not saying that at all. Well, you know, maybe we can do something. So it's like the data helps like turn those conversations around. And that is why actually I'm saying why we need to be lobbyists, because I watched my lobbyist say to that response, yeah, I know how the livestock grows are, or it's really challenging to go up against them. And then they'd fold. They folded too fast. we don't fold as vegans, and that's why we make the perfect lobbyists. We figure out the loophole and we figure out the way to like get stuff passed and get people to agree with us. And every meeting that I've had, we literally get to that point where they agree with us, because it's just like the social media trolls and everything that we've practiced for years, right? It literally is the same way.
Thank you very much for that impassioned response. The next question comes from Gina Santos, and she asks, Connie, have you spoken to Senator Cory Booker about pushing vegan food policies?
So I'm going to take a quick stance. So a lot of different policy groups work with Cory Booker. Cory Booker is a huge advocate and great, but you need a bunch of other senators, especially rural senators, to agree with you on policy. And if we just keep focusing on the one vegan who keeps pushing policy that doesn't get signed, because again, you need the agreement from the rest, we're putting all our eggs in one basket. I think he's great. I think working with him is great. I think what he needs and what we need is to get the rest of them on board so that his stuff can get passed. Does that make sense? So we do talk to him in his office, but we focus on a lot of the rural Republican farming states and on purpose, strategically. I hope that makes sense. It's not a brush off. We love Cory and we love the policy that he presents and backs, but we have to get to the point where we transition the mindsets of the rural farming states. It's not all rural farming states. California is not a rural state, and it's literally the biggest dairy state in the United States. But the point is that we have to make sure that we have the conservative farming districts or states, on our side.
Absolutely, Connie. We have a host of questions. Stacy, I asked one of yours. I didn't mention your name, but that was the one about having the guts to go into the halls of Congress to do this sort of work. Deb, I don't think we've asked one of your questions yet, so you are up next. And this will be the final question for the segment, as we do need to move on. What is the current status of the EATS Act?
So right now, our focus is purely on the Farm Bill. The EATS Act, I think, is still in play, but I don't think we're at a point where it's going to get signed. So, and that's why we're focusing on the Farm Bill and not those bills specifically right now. So the Farm Bill is every 5 years. Our goal, the Farm Bill literally expires right now, and the government shutdown is sort of tripping everything up. The Farm Bill is the Super Bowl of food policy, and our focus is getting language inserted in the Farm Bill, and we have a really good shot at it. So think of like standalone policy, like the EATS Act is being a standalone policy. The Farm Bill is like a gazillion policies in one, and you can get funding and expansion there. So I think the EATS Act is still in play. We definitely support a lot of the different vegan, animal saving, dairy reducing type of stuff, but we're not experts at those bills right now. And that's just because the Farm Bill is like I said, it's do or die. Once this ends, probably in December, January, that's when we'll start focusing on a lot more of the individual bills. And we're also going to be coming out with our own, our second piece of legislation to start pushing that's related to carbon capture.
Absolutely, Connie. Thank you so much for your excellent insight.
So Adam Schiff would be great to speak to when it comes to local policy as as a House rep. He again is in a city and he doesn't represent the rural states. So that's where I want you to feel empowered when you have these relationships to start creating, and something we'll help do. We're going to create templatized legislation where everybody can sort of grab at it and use it to go to their local offices. But as mentioned, so Susan, I saw your line, again, there's so many politicians. Our focus right now really is largely those that have farming districts and are getting a lot of the livestock money. We're trying to change that.
Okay, Connie, you've convinced me to give you one more question. This is another question from Gina, and she says she is ready right here, right now to get involved in lobbying in DC, and she's wondering how people could get involved. With you mentioning the templatized legislation, maybe there are some opportunities to get involved even without traveling to DC.
For sure. So, okay, so I'm gonna give you a representation of what templatized legislation can do. Within the last year, you saw abortion changes state by state changing, and it was because one group created a template for those abortion changes. One group. And they created it not even specific, like they even said it wasn't actual legislation. They expected the states to like revise it and make it more thorough. States literally passed it. The state legislators passed it without even editing it. And that's why like rapid fire, you just saw all this stuff happening. Now imagine we use that template for us and we're like, they can't combat it. They cannot combat, you know, these helicopters, literally the president helicopters, you hear that in the background, the like helicopters. I wish I could show you. It's wild here. So the templatized legislation is a tactic the other side uses, or I'm not going to say the other side, that is used a lot. And what that means is there's a baseline legislation and they distribute to local, state, federal, everywhere, and you have multiple groups at the same time or individuals pushing for it. And we need to start doing that. And now that we know how to write policy, we believe that we can start templatizing this. Again, we have to move past the farm bill, I think probably December, and we're going to start pushing that stuff out. And I want it to become a thing. I want AFA to be the central air traffic control for templatized policy and for just people to grab and start pushing it, whether they're people groups or extensions of AFA, what have you. So Gina, where are you located, Gina? If you are near DC, I mean, I'd be happy for when we have meetings or whatever, if you wanted to do a ride along. That's what I want to get the youth to do. I want them to come here and have ride alongs with us and understand the gravity of this. And like I said, and it's exciting. It's really exciting.
Absolutely. She lives in the California, Los Angeles area, so it'd be quite the trek. But she also writes in, wow, templatized legislation sounds like a powerful tool. And when you gave the example of what they accomplished with respect to abortion rights, I am very interested in supporting your beautiful vision of what we can do lobbying-wise for this movement. That concludes our main speaker lineup. I would ask that all of you stay just another 5 or so minutes so I can make some closing remarks. We've heard from many phenomenal activists in the movement today, but there are things we can do to take the knowledge that we already have and that we gained from today's proceedings and apply them to future activism. At Project Animal Freedom, we are working to build a fully vegan Midwest by 2056 through a strategic chapter-based system. But we do many events that have a focus far beyond the Midwest, and we try to have an impact far beyond the Midwest. Our Vegan Climate Summit today has people joining from North America, Europe, and Africa, 3 of the continents. So I'm very grateful for that to be the case. We might even have South America. I just didn't notice any signups from South America. I didn't take a close look yet. But anyway, one of our key strategic goals is to address the rapidly worsening climate and ecological emergency facing all life on Earth. And as part of that, we have 2 major programs. We have our Vegan Climate Summit, and we also have our Worldwide Vegan Climate March. We also organize dozens of other events on year, many times movie screenings, sometimes member meetings with speakers like Hope Bohannic, who discussed the humane hoax at our September 4th meeting earlier this month. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is to sign up to join our mailing list if you haven't done so already. If you got a ticket to this event through, for example, the bit.ly/vegan climate summit link, you are already on the mailing list. But if you joined free of charge and did not sign up and get a ticket, then please sign up right now. Chance, can you share the links in the chat? We'll give Chance just a moment to grab the links, but I will also show you another part of our environmental activism, and this is very fun wearable activism. But let me show you our website real quick. We have one of the largest, most impressive collections of vegan apparel in the world. Well, not the largest, but we have high quality designs. We definitely have high quality designs, and we have collections where you can find, for example, environmental themed t-shirts. And here is just a sampling of some of what we had. There is no economy on a dead planet. I think this shirt is ugly, but it's one of our best sellers. My dad even bought it. Warning, meat is fucking up the planet. That's one of my favorite. Our first keynote speaker at our first ever vegan climate summit 2 years ago got that shirt. Winter is not coming for your Game of Thrones fans. Save our oceans, and so on and so forth. We will grow this collection over time, but that's specifically what we have pegged under environment. So you can't just fight for the cause, you can also wear the cause. I really believe in walking around wearing pro-vegan clothing as a way to influence societal attitudes toward veganism and in turn help save animals. But again, going back to our mailing list, you can join our mailing list by going to projectanimalfreedom.org/subscribe or by going here to our homepage and clicking join our mailing list. And you'll just enter all your information, and then you'll stay updated about all our upcoming events. You'll be added to our mailing list. You'll be added to our texting list. Only about 30% of our supporters see our emails, which is actually higher than the industry standard for the nonprofit sector, but it's still dismally low in my opinion. But 98% of texts are read. So if you really want to know about events like our Vegan Climate Summit and our Worldwide Vegan Climate March, then you need to join our mailing list as soon as possible. Chance, were you able to share those links? Oh no. Oh yes, you were. Thank you, Chance. Thank you for being a lifesaver. Yeah, I didn't really prepare anything fancy for you here at the end. I want to thank you just for sticking around, giving us an extra 5 minutes and allowing us to go about 30 minutes over schedule. I just appreciate seeing you all. The speakers in particular, you give me hope that a better world is possible, that catastrophic climate change isn't inevitable, that we can build a fully vegan world. So thank you so much for sharing your unique insight into the various aspects of the movement that you're working in. And thank you to everyone who joined us today to pool our collective knowledge and then transform that knowledge into action for the animals. For example, as Connie was talking about, through not digitized, templatized legislation. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been great seeing you here at our 3rd annual Vegan Climate Summit. We will do this yet again, and if you want to be the first to hear, make sure to go to projectanimalfreedom.org/subscribe. Real quick overview of the other links before I end. Projectanimalfreedom.org/shop. That's where you can get some amazing vegan apparel, and we have many amazing vegan designs beyond the handful that I just showed you. Donate. We rely on donations to survive. And if you can donate $5, $10, $20, especially monthly, that makes a huge difference in sustaining our work and providing vital outreach through events like our Vegan Climate Summit, our Worldwide Vegan Climate March. And then finally, there is some other link, but I forget what it is. So you are all free to leave. Thank you so much for joining us for our 3rd annual Vegan Climate Summit. We hope to see you for our Worldwide Vegan Climate March next year and for next year's Vegan Climate Summit.